Chapter 5:35. The powerful gargoyles, the agile and fearless undead Naga army, as well as the Ratman army that was not worth mentioning in individual combat, but had a ridiculous amount of numbers. Such a combination was a force that could not be ignored in any hell. Huaishur could be said to have gained a lot from this summoning, but in fact, he was in a bad mood. Any fat sheep that had been ruthlessly ripped off several times would not be in a good mood, even if they were not the ones paying the bill. This would only highlight Huaishur's incompetence, even if everyone knew that it was the Ivy League's doing. The gargoyles that opened their mouths like lions, the unruly undead Naga army, and even the ratmen that looked spectacular but could only fight with ease. No matter which one it was, they were not the type that could be easily controlled. If there was a battle, then so be it. It was completely wishful thinking to expect them to work for the Ivory Tower. A power that could not be truly controlled was not considered a power. At best, it was just for show. He might have spent money to invite a bunch of masters back. Huaishur's original expectations for this summoning were almost completely dashed. He could only try his best to compensate for the damage caused by the Ivy League's plan being suddenly thwarted. Just blowing the trumpet caused him to fall into such a passive situation, and he was almost flustered. The embarrassment brought by reality made Huaishur want to be incompetent and furious, but in the end, he restrained himself from such a loser behavior. He forced himself to remain calm. After presiding over the ceremony, he once again began the unplanned summoning. This time, he threw aside all the media provided by the Iron Crystal Constellation and began the last summoning of the day. For a long time after the light shone, there was no sound. Huaishur pulled out the Sword of Virtue and inserted it again. He hung up and replayed, and replayed. He had to patiently throw a series of harassment messages into the abyss, until a helpless voice came from the Matrix. "Hello, I'm not here. Please leave a message. Don't pull the wool over my eyes. I know you're at home." Huaishur sneered and bluntly exposed the other party's lie. "To be honest, I'm not in a good mood right now. If you hang up on me, I'll definitely try my best to bring the people from the Astronomy Club to find you and have a chat. What are you saying?" Kitten's tone became aggrieved, as if Huaishur had done something heartless. "We're all family, there's no need to be like this. Then return the authorization fee to me." "Hello? The signal is bad, so I can't hear you." Kitten raised her voice and asked blankly, "What are you talking about? Do you want to hang up and call again? All right, stop pretending. I'm not here to ask you for money. Then you must have something even more troublesome waiting for me. Why don't you bring the Astronomy Association to raid my house?" Kitten let out a long sigh. "Do you think it's easy for me to earn some dishonest money? You are the Prince of Paradise, okay? The copyright image is part of the paradise. I've given you so many benefits, and I've only collected a little authorization fee from you. Why are you always thinking about it? Don't you have any gratitude?" Huaishur didn't say anything. He just raised his eyebrows and looked at the outline that faintly appeared in the matrix. It wasn't until Kitten began to have goosebumps all over his body that he smiled. "Since you admit that I'm the Prince of Paradise, then it's reasonable for me to use the people from the legal department, right?" "No." Kitten shook her head and flatly refused. "All transfers that are not within the authority of the paradise are against the rules. You'd better kill me." Huaishur said calmly, "I'll pay." Kitten fell into silence. Huaishur spoke again. "You can name the price." Kitten didn't speak again. She opened her mouth several times as if she wanted to refuse, but Huaishur's promise was too tempting. She didn't know how to reply. "It's up to you whether you agree or not." Huaishur waited for too long and was a little impatient. "If you don't agree, I'll leave. In the future, I'll break up with the paradise, and don't mention the title of the Prince of Paradise anymore. Is there a reason in the world to use others as a signboard and not help at all when something happens? After a short silence, Kitten finally couldn't help but sigh. I can only give you 5. Recently, the paradise has been expanding, and there's really not enough manpower. Okay, Weischer said, but I want the few who worked with me last time. And this has to be considered a business trip. In addition to food, accommodation, and transportation subsidies, the employment fee will be doubled, 9 to 5, and overtime on weekends will be charged separately. Okay. Kitten asked for a high price, and Weischer returned the money. He said decisively, but if that's the case, I'll have to use my authorization fee as collateral to pay part of it. Also, you have to give me a receipt and invoice 3 times the amount. Hiss. On the other side, Kitten sucked in a breath of cold air and sighed with emotion. Are you still human? Look at what you're saying. These days, it's not easy to make some dishonest money. Weischer calmly returned the original words. Kitten was speechless. It didn't say that it couldn't do so, although it didn't want to give out the copyright and licensing fees for Weischer's poems. Compared to the huge amount of employment fees, the licensing fees were just a small addition. So, it simply wiped out the zeros for him. But Weischer's show made it a little dizzy. It shocked Kitten for a whole year. After eating the first party, eating the second party, falsely reporting the purchase price, and still forcefully receiving rebates. Why was this trick so good? Was this really the pure and harmless little guy from back then? Although it was said that learning to be good for 3 years and bad for 3 days, after not seeing him for a few months, he had become so bad. Wasn't it 2F asterisk king ridiculous? But what did this have to do with Kitten? It settled then. It immediately made the decision and happily rubbed its little hands. Sign the contract. 5 minutes later, Weischer deducted the part of his copyright fee from the urgently delivered advance payment, stuffed it into his bag, and threw the rest into the summoning matrix. Then, as the light lit up, 5 tall good brothers in black suits and sunglasses walked out of the matrix. The leader nodded to Weischer and saluted. After greeting the Prince of Kitten Paradise, he handed over a set of invoices and receipts for Kitten Paradise. Then, without needing to be told, he led the team and stood behind Weischer, looking like a personal bodyguard, the prince's hired thug. Weischer waved to Lin Sergio, who was rushing over from afar, and then handed over the invoice. Take it to the head of affairs to report the account. Weischer paused for a moment and said to the hut in the forest, tell him that when the money from the ivory tower arrives, the extra money will be distributed as welfare subsidies. Also, give more compensation to the deceased members. Life in hell is not easy, so just treat it as secretary while treating everyone to a meal. From the beginning to the end of the negotiation process, Weischer did not hide it from the iron crystal constellation. The wolf dog was squatting next to him. Besides, what was the point of hiding this kind of thing? Could they report him to the head of the iron crystal constellation? Sorry, I'm the head of the iron crystal constellation, and he didn't embezzle much. He didn't even keep a cent of the extra money. He just took back his own copyright fee. Although it was somewhat against the rules, wasn't it good? He got back his copyright fee, the iron crystal constellation got reinforcements, and all the members got benefits. Everyone had a bright future. How good was that? After confirming that Weischer's safety was not a problem, the wolf dog nudged Weischer a few times, and then left with its tail wagging. Lin Sergio, with a look of panic, was still standing there without moving. What's the matter? Weischer asked. That group of hell. They started fighting before the contract was signed. After they were separated, they were still arguing and shouting that they wanted to see you. So fast. Weischer laughed. What a coincidence. I also have something to talk to them about. For some reason, his mood which had been terrible for a long time, suddenly became cheerful. He couldn't wait. When Weishur arrived at the Iron Crystal Constellation's outer encampment, the temporarily built hall was already in a mess. But at least they didn't fight in front of Weishur. A few large groups clearly occupied the corners of the room. The person in charge of the contract signing was livid. He stood in the middle and didn't say a word. Obviously, he was very angry. Weishur walked in and waved at him to calm down. Then he looked at the group of gargoyles. What's going on? The leader of the gargoyles calmly held up the completed contract scroll in his hand, indicating that they had signed the contract and that the chaos had nothing to do with them. The ones causing trouble were the undead Nagas and the rat men. I'm sorry for causing trouble, but we can't accept living with other people. Among the Nagas, the one who had white scales stepped forward. He looked like he was old. The scales on his face were full of gaps. His left eye was blind, but his right eye was frighteningly bright. In order to ensure that the mounts are in good condition and of good rest, we request separate lodging and food. You should have said so earlier. Okay, no problem. Weishur smiled warmly. How about I arrange separate lodging for you? If you're not satisfied, I'll ask someone to build more for you. Your needs will be prioritized. Do you have any other questions? And the one who gave the name was about to say something, but when he saw the young man's dark eyes and passionate expression, he didn't know why, but when he was about to say something more, he was stuck. He paused for a long time and suddenly shook his head. No, that's all. He said, we're very satisfied with all the arrangements. Is that so? That's good. Weishur seemed to be relieved. He held the undead army's hand enthusiastically. Our ivory tower and the undead army have a deep friendship. Naturally, we shouldn't mistreat them in this place. If there's anything you're not satisfied with, please do tell me. Oh, okay. After a short pause, the one who gave the name nodded and returned to the formation. Its deputy flicked its tongue and asked in a low voice in their language, Honorable Elder, didn't you say that you could increase the price based on their situation? Don't worry. I still feel that something is wrong. The leader of the group was silent for a long time. He pulled a piece of dry grass from his leather bag and stuffed it into his mouth. Let's wait and see. He said, let's wait and see. Behind the cover of his subordinates, he quietly looked at the young man who was surrounded and quarreled with the rat men. He felt that something was wrong. From the moment he saw the young man, his sharp intuition, which had been brought about by hundreds of battles, had been beating wildly. There was no warning, and it brought about an uneasy premonition for no reason. He could not understand it, but at the same time, it was so real that he subconsciously followed the guidance of his intuition and chose to stop while he was ahead. After a long period of observation, he could not see anything special about the young man. When he was about to look away, he saw the light tubes hanging from the ceiling. He suddenly felt a chill all over his body. He finally noticed where the abnormality was. In a daze, the old rat man narrowed his eyes and looked at Weishur's feet. It was unbelievable. Why did that person have 5 shadows? Before he could think carefully, chaos spread out again. The ratman's sharp screams stuttered. This is different from what we agreed on. Among the ratmen, a burly ratman in chainmail pulled Weishur's collar angrily. He led his subordinates and began to clamor. Chongqing, Greenvine, the price you offered is much higher than what you offered. You have to pay more. End of 2 chapters. Please vote monthly. Chapter 536. Unknowingly, the situation started to spiral out of control. The alchemist, who had come to help, panicked when he realized that Weishur had been surrounded by the rat men. He was shoving and stumbling in the crowd, hearing their leader's voice. The other rat men also began to shout out in unison. We quit! We quit! No, no meat! This is not fair, not fair! We want an SS explanation. The king of the ivory tower. Bastard, you're all liars. Liar, liar! Amidst the clamor, the hundreds of rat men were agitated and screaming. When the leader saw the undead army watching coldly from the side without any intention of interfering, he shouted even louder. We're here for the ivory tower. The leader tugged at Huaishur's clothes. He was almost a head taller than Huaishur and was furious. He was very conspicuous because he was the only white rat in the group. Perhaps he was angry or something else, but his eyes turned red. He did not even stutter when he spoke. Your conscience is bad, bad to the core. The Ivy League, the price they're offering is twice as high as yours. You black-hearted merchants. You don't even give us a break. We want to protest. Protest. The last word of protest was filled with righteous indignation, piercing everyone's eardrums. The other rat folk also roared, Protest! Ratmen have human rights too. The leader raised his paw and led his subordinates to shout together. We want an 8-hour work day. An 8-hour work day. We want a reasonable holiday. We want life insurance. We want to fight against oppression. The leader shouted at the top of his lungs. We want to go on strike. Go on strike. Go on strike. The ratmen's response almost flipped the ceiling. The group of rat men waved their weapons wildly. Somehow, they found a pile of dirty yellow cloth and put it on their bodies, then roared excitedly together with their leader. Behind the outer encampment, in the iron crystal seat, all the people in charge stood in front of the screen. Their faces were so ugly that water was about to drip out. On top of the iron crystal, the heavy cannons silently turned and aimed at this group of incompetent fools. However, before that, everyone remained silent and did not issue any orders. The situation was not out of control yet. It was not their place to interfere. But now, the real person in charge was acting submissively in front of that group of people, not daring to make a sound. This caused the people in charge, who had some expectations, for Huaishur to fall into deep disappointment. Even though he was being shoved and yelled at like this, he couldn't even stand up straight in front of the chaos abyss. He could only smile awkwardly and raise his hands in an attempt to calm everyone down, but nobody paid him any attention. Apart from the expressionless gargoyles who were resting with their eyes closed, even the serpentmen cavalry who were at loggerheads with the abyss rats sneered and stood to the side. Watching the show, they didn't have the slightest intention of interfering. It was obvious that he was planning to take advantage of this opportunity to make a huge profit. This group of rat orcs was not afraid of making a big fuss. They naturally had the confidence to be here. Although their individual qualities were not as good as the gargoyles and serpentmen cavalry, they were undoubtedly the most numerous. Moreover, among them there were a total of 4 nominees who came this time. Moreover, the one leading them was a wearer who was appointed by the Abyss. He was fully deserving of being the leader of a large group. They were not afraid of making a big deal out of it. At most, they would break up and seek refuge with the Ivy League. They would work for whichever side gave them more money. This was not the first time they did business on the battlefield. Why would they care about the appeasement and advice of a sissy? Originally, the leader of the wearers didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but he didn't expect that the commander this time would be such a coward. If he didn't take the opportunity to rob, how could he go back to his hometown and marry many dirty women and give birth to many stinky brats? Everyone, don't worry. Huaishur's clothes had been torn several times in the shoving, and his hair was messy. He comforted in horror. We can talk. All of this can be talked. This leader, please say something, and let everyone wait first. Can't we wait first? Talk. The leader laughed coldly. How do you plan on talking? Weisher was startled. He looked around, embarrassed, and finally looked at the tall rat man in front of him. This leader, may I ask, what's your name? Alec. The tall and sturdy white rat man rubbed the fur on his head and glanced at Weisher. Call me Alec. Then, Alec, is it convenient for us to talk somewhere else? Weisher walked closer, raised his hand, and stealthily stuffed an origin form crystal into Alec's hand. He lowered his voice and said, "It's not very convenient here. Isn't it better if we talk about some things in private?" Alec was about to turn hostile and fly into a rage, but immediately afterwards, he felt Weisher shove another origin form crystal into his hand. His expression froze. When he noticed that Weisher would occasionally glance guiltily at the camera in the corner, he seemed to understand something. He tugged at his mustache and harumphed coldly. We can talk about anything. What's important is whether or not there's sincerity. Yes, there's a lot of sincerity. Weisher nodded vigorously, shoving another origin form crystal over. Okay, then I'll go with you to talk. As he spoke, Alec gave a look behind him, indicating for 2 of the 4 remaining naming masters to follow him. Immediately afterwards, he unhappily ordered, Is this how the ivory tower treats its guests? Making them stand there, not giving them any water to drink, starving them? There's wine and meat. Weisher nodded vigorously, then glared at Lynn Sergio, who wasn't too far away. What are you still standing there for? Hurry up and arrange dinner for your friends. Tell the kitchen to bring out the best meat. Also, didn't I bring 2 bottles of red wine? Hurry up and bring them out for everyone to moisten their mouths. Lynn Sergio stared blankly for a long time, then hurriedly ran out. Very quickly, in the iron crystal seats dining hall, wine and food were served at the same price as water. Among the Nagas, a young commander with mottled colors coldly glanced at Weisher as he bowed and welcomed the ratmen into his office. He lowered his head in disdain and spat a mouthful of venom onto the ground, making a hissing sound. Cowards! Esteemed elder, why did we have to deal with this kind of trash this time? Isn't this even better? With those ratmen starting, it's easier for us to raise the price. Even if we can't win, we have to at least earn some money. The esteemed elder continued to chew on the dried grass, his snake tongue flicking out slightly as he tasted the flavor in the air. However, he didn't allow his children and subordinates to cause trouble. The spare reins around his wrist were tightly wrapped, not loosening in the slightest. Wait. He fearfully glanced at the indifferent gargoyles standing not far away and said, "Wait a little longer." As an elite army that frequently battled between infernal realms, the Naga's undying army possessed great mobility and the ability to fight for a long time. At the same time, their military discipline had also become increasingly strict due to the harsh atmosphere among the Nagas. Early on, when they had responded to the summons, each Naga had brought 2 weeks' worth of rations. Even when Lynn Sergio warmly invited them to the welcoming banquet, they didn't touch the bowls and chopsticks in the ivory tower. They didn't use the fragrant delicacies in front of them. They ate brick-made rations made from grass cakes and only drank the water they brought. They were extremely vigilant. As for the gargoyles, they didn't need to eat at all. Even if their bodies were occasionally damaged, they could just eat some stones and iron to replenish it. When they actually ate, they ate all kinds of origin substances similar to origin crystals. Basically, 2 to 3 times a month was enough. On the other hand, the ratmen quickly began to let go of their restraints, especially after Weisher's precious wine was served in the small house in the forest. The wine emitted an enticing aroma that was as red as blood. It tempted the rat-men so much that their eyes turned red. Even though each of them was only given a small cup, they still couldn't help but immerse themselves in the wonderful taste. They were so drunk that they went crazy. Even the Nagas beside them couldn't help but twitch their noses when they smelled the wine. Humph! The young commander harumphed coldly. He reached out and pressed his hand on the short knife at his waist, preparing to stand up. However, he saw the respected elder opposite him raise his head and look at him coldly. "Chow Lu, what are you trying to do?" "You even need to ask?" Chow Lu said indignantly. "Only the victors can enjoy the wine. If we don't enjoy it, do those bastards have the right to? Whether they have the right or not is not up to you to decide." The respected elder said indifferently, "The wine is not yours and victory is not yours. The principle is, only when you have victory will you be given the wine, not for you to reach out and take it yourself. This is not something that a guest should do, nor is it something that an employee should think." But what?" The respected elder asked coldly. "Are you questioning my orders? Chow Lu, are you trying to disobey me? If so, please draw your knife. Before the owner of this place returns, we can dance with our swords to liven things up for them." "I don't dare." Chow Lu crawled in a panic and lay behind the table, ignoring the soup on his body. The respected elder did not say anything else. He only ate the straw bricks and dry food bit by bit with the water he brought, sitting quietly and waiting. In his heart, the uneasy premonition grew stronger and stronger. Not long after, the screen on the ceiling above their heads suddenly lit up, and the scene in the office appeared. Before they could see it clearly, an embarrassed voice was heard. Isn't this price a little expensive?" "Expensive? How is it expensive?" Alec angrily slammed his hand on the table. Life is priceless. It's just doubled. You black-hearted profiteers. Don't tell me you're not even willing to pay this little bit of money? No, that's not what I meant." Huaishur awkwardly wiped the sweat off his forehead and raised his head to look at Alec. Alec's expression was gloomy as he looked at him coldly. He immediately shrank back. Okay, this price. I'll get someone to bring the money up." The originally tidy office had become a mess. Behind Alec's sofa, the two nominees who had followed him had almost turned the office upside down. They were still fighting over the pistol hanging on the wall. Needless to say, the little fly carving on the handle was quite exquisite. One could tell at a glance that it was good stuff. Not long after, a girl in a gray dress pushed a cart in. As the box in the cart was opened towards Alec, the origin form crystals piled up inside lit up with a bright light. It almost dazzled the rat man's small eyes. Where had it ever seen so many origin form crystals? How many dirty women could it marry, and how many children could it give birth to? It wasn't just him. The two subordinates behind him were also stunned, forgetting to fight over the pistol. Alec's saliva dripped down as he subconsciously reached for the boxes. However, Huaishur seemed to have finally mustered up his courage and reached out to press against the box. "Wait, what's wrong?" Alec frowned, his expression becoming fierce. "Are you going to go back on your word? The money I promised will definitely be given to you." Huaishur stared at him, his expression becoming nervous. "But after taking the money, you have to do something, right?" Alec froze for a moment before revealing a smile. Don't worry, of course." He patted his chest and promised with a trembling voice. It wasn't like he needed money to say a few words. The contract hadn't been signed yet, so what was the point of empty promises? Naturally, he had to get the money first. He impatiently snatched the box from Alec's hands and stroked the origin form crystals inside, almost drooling. Our Sharp-Fong tribe's words are as good as 9 cauldrons. Since we've taken your money, we'll definitely work for you. Bow, 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 die, 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 die. Is that so? That's good. The young man sitting across from him let out a sigh of relief and smiled as he waved his hand. There's no need to die before yourself. How embarrassing. Just die is enough. The silence was sudden. Alec finally realized that something wasn't right amidst the light from the origin form crystals. He raised his head, but the 2 subordinates behind him had already gone silent. He didn't know where they had gone. Only the bone-chilling sound of chewing could be heard from the darkness. On the display screen, the white mouse hugging the origin form crystals sat on the sofa, looking around in confusion. The smile from before still remained on its face. However, behind the spacious sofa, one black shadow after another slowly appeared. It was Huaishir's shadow. He didn't know when it had been stretched to such an extent, but it slowly bulged behind it, forming a pitch-black silhouette. It was currently smiling savagely at him. He froze and immediately pulled out his blade. However, he couldn't pull out the blade. More accurately, when the shadow behind him raised its hand and pressed it against his shoulder, all of his resistance had been stripped away. No matter if it was the relics from the border hidden on his body, or the immense power he possessed, or even the noble status of the person wearing the clothes, he couldn't resist at all. Under that ice-cold hand, after leaving the theme park, the strength of the legal department naturally fell. However, no matter how much their strength fell, their essence hadn't changed. They were the rules created by the theme park, the spirits of contracts formed from fairy tales and dreams. Even though they had already fallen into hell, their pure essence hadn't changed at all. It could be said that each of them was a movable relic from the border, forming a human-shaped contract from hell. In the instant that Alec nodded, it was equivalent to using this pile of origin form crystals to sell the lives of his entire clan. It was simply a joke for a mere person wearing the clothes to want to go back on a deal that they had witnessed. Little bastard, what are you trying to do? In an instant, Alec's eyes turned blood red. He roared angrily, "Immediately make them let go. Do you believe that I won't make you regret it? HM, weren't you the one who said that you would sell your life? You even want to die for yourself?" The figure with his back to the camera calmly asked back, as if he was smiling. He spread out his hands. "Now, I've already given you the money. Please give me your life." Alec roared angrily and struggled with all his might. However, under the gaze of the shadow from the legal department, he couldn't move. Soon after, his valiant and ferocious appearance disappeared without a trace. He skillfully squeezed out a flattering smile. Sir, don't be like this. I was joking. It was all a joke. A joke." "But I wasn't joking." Huaishir calmly sighed. "Just sit there and don't move." He slowly got up and slowly and carefully rolled up the sleeves of his dress. Then he unbuttoned the sleeves of his shirt and folded them up in 2, revealing his well-proportioned forearms. He announced softly to Alec, "I'll go and get it myself." Alec's eyes widened. He wanted to scream, but behind him, 2 hands suddenly covered his mouth. Then, Huaishir's shadow covered his eyes. A gorgeous sacrificial knife appeared from his slender fingers. He thrust it forward and pierced Alec's throat, causing all his struggles to stop abruptly. Then, he skillfully turned half a circle. When the melon was ripe, it would fall. The moment Huaishir made his move, chaos spread from the hall. Seeing that their leader was restrained by Huaishir, most of the rat orcs instantly pulled out their weapons from the cushions under their buttocks. They roared and screamed, wanting to cause chaos. But then it was as if a cage had been opened. The overwhelming crow tide roared and covered the sky. Like a black cloud, it enveloped all the rat orcs. Countless in different crimson, eyes looked down like stars. They stared at their food. Before the rat orcs could resist, their bodies suddenly went limp, and they lost all their strength. In an instant, they felt their vision go dark. Countless mushrooms jumped out of the vegetables and danced around them hand in hand, like little people. Soon, numerous rashes and blisters began to grow on his face and body. However, in such a large group, there were still many people who did not let down their guard. More rat orcs had shockingly high resistance to poison, and they forced themselves to get up from the ground. "Liar! Liar!" The nominator who stayed behind screamed angrily. The ivory tower lied to us. Rebel! Rebel! Kill all these liars. Go and find Chongqing. Lin Shizhou curled his lips and reached out. Just as he was about to take out a gun from his pocket, a mournful howl suddenly burst out. It stunned him on the spot. It was as if thunder had suddenly exploded in the secret room. Amidst the high-pitched howl, a pitch-black arrow had already whistled past and pierced into the rat orc's eye socket. It pulled at it and nailed it to the wall that had just been painted not long ago. Only half of the arrow feather was exposed outside, and it was buzzing in its eye socket. "How dare you betray the contract?" A hoarse and cold voice sounded. Just as the undead army drew their bows and arrows and pulled out their weapons, the old snake man Supreme Elder had already stood up and stepped on the table. He shouted angrily at the rat orcs. "You bunch of trash! How dare you make an enemy of the undead army?" Bearing the brunt of the attack, his deputy, Chow Lu, took a step forward and appeared a few meters away. The scimitar in his hand hummed softly, and a handful of blood splattered. Behind him, the two rat orcs who had rushed the fastest and shouted the loudest had already been cut in half at the waist. Within 3 breaths, those who kneel will not be killed. Chow Lu raised his hand. Behind him, more than 40 Snake Man undead army had already raised the black bows in their hands, pulled the bowstrings, and aimed at the limp rat orcs. Before Huaishi's men could even make a move, the chaos had abruptly ended. It was as if it had suddenly started. Not long after, when Huaishi returned to the hall, everything had returned to silence. It was as if the buzzing strings of a zither had been smoothed by an invisible hand. No one dared to make any discordant sounds in front of this young man. Oh, so it was the Supreme Elder who made a move. After understanding the whole story, Huaishi sat at the table at the head of the table and took a hot towel from Yuan. After wiping his hands, he finally sat properly and raised his head to ask, "Why did you help me, Supreme Elder? Shouldn't it be better to cause as much trouble as possible at this time?" "The undead army also has a backbone," the Supreme Elder said solemnly. "Even if we are humans' dogs, we won't be hyenas that eat rotten meat. Moreover, as your mercenaries, isn't it natural for us to quell the chaos for you? It's rare for you to have this kind of heart. That couldn't be better." Huaishi smiled and turned his head to look at the leader of the gargoyles. Then why didn't the gargoyles do anything when the undead army quelled the chaos? Behind the table, the burly gargoyle who was resting with his eyes closed slowly raised his eyes and answered calmly, "As the commander, you didn't give any orders, did you?" "That's right." Huaishi nodded and said approvingly, "Both of you are very good and very right. To be able to get the help of both of you, compared to this war, we are not far from victory. Unfortunately, some people didn't think so and instead made some mistakes, which made people a little." He paused for a moment and looked down at the trembling rat orcs below with pity. He shook his head and sighed. It made people a little helpless. In the dead silence, no one said anything else. "There's nothing we can do. The big mistake has been made, and many things can't be undone." Huaishi sighed softly. "But we can't immerse ourselves in the past. As people, we have to look forward. We can't be calculative, and we can't vent our anger on more people because of some people's misdeeds, right? Many rat orcs raised their heads in surprise, wanting to agree with why sure. However, when they raised their heads and saw that pair of black eyes, they couldn't say anything. It was as if their hearts were grabbed by that gaze, and they couldn't breathe in the stiffness. You should have heard Alex promise. Why sure said calmly, all of your lives have been given to the ivory tower for the price of 400 origin crystals. This is the contract that Alex signed with his own blood. Therefore, I announce that all of you will forever belong to the slave army of the Iron Crystal Constellation. You will serve here until the end of your lives. While you are alive, you will fight for the ivory tower. After you die, your corpses will become the unbreakable foundation of the ivory tower in this hell, until one day, when I think that the results you have created are enough to redeem your lives, your contributions will end. Apart from that, no one can shake the unbreakable bond between us. Here, I look forward to your enthusiastic performance on the front lines. I also promise that even if you die in battle, I will definitely send the money you paid for your lives to your tribe. Along with the calm words, a severe chill slowly spread out. Under the indifferent gaze of the crows and the surveillance of the legal department, no rat orc dared to stand up and speak. As members of the large group, each of them was the property of the leader of the large group. Moreover, there was no such thing as human rights among the abyss rat orcs. Now that Huaishur was willing to spare their lives, they were too late to rejoice. How could there be anyone who would oppose him? Then it's settled. Huaishur smiled and clapped his hands. He waved at the camera, indicating that the alchemists could make explosive collars for their slaves. Under the fierce suppression and sweeping, more than 800 rat orcs were branded with the emblem of the ivory tower. Henceforth, they became one of the mobile properties of the Iron Crystal Constellation. There was no longer any possibility of resistance. Huaishur was happy with the 800 cannon fodder, and his smile became more and more cheerful. And in this short silence, someone patted the crowd and stood under Huaishur's table. Your Excellency, Huaishur. The old revered elder suddenly said, I have a question to ask you. Huaishur raised his eyebrows and nodded. Please speak. I know that your Excellency is a powerful and determined person, and I also know that your Excellency's power is not something that we can resist, but because of this, there are some things that I have to say. The revered elder raised his amber eyes, stared at Huaishur's face, and asked in a solemn voice, Today, we are soldiers you hired, your subordinates. Even if we are despised mercenaries and wild war dogs, we are also people who have gambled our lives to win for you. Since the moment we signed the contract, we have been your lackeys. But why can't you be honest with us, and instead want to tempt us into chaos? Regardless of the fact that Huaishur had just launched a purge in front of his eyes, the revered elder of the snake orcs raised his head and asked, Can such behavior be exchanged for loyalty? Silence suddenly fell. The sound of breathing seemed to have disappeared. Even the gargoyle, who had been looking down from beginning to end, raised his eyes and looked at the two at the moment. The revered elder calmly waited for Huaishur's reply, not showing any signs of weakness or uneasiness. Huaishur also did not fly into a rage, but instead revealed a strange smile. After a long time, he nodded in agreement. You are right. There is nothing more precious in this world than sincerity and sincerity. This, I deeply understand. I did not give you enough trust. This is indeed my mistake. He sighed softly, but then suddenly asked, But in this world, even in hell, is there anything more difficult than being honest with one another, Your Excellency? He lowered his eyes, stared at the old snake orc below, and asked word by word, Sincerity is mutual, isn't it? If you ask me, loyalty should also be mutual. If you did not use sincerity to exchange for sincerity, why wait until now to ask me such a boring question? The silence suddenly froze at this moment, as if everything had been frozen. As that pair of eyes looked down, the warmth and smile flowing within gradually faded, replaced by a kind of heart-palpitating coldness and darkness, as solemn as the abyss. After a long time, the corners of the old snake orc's eyes twitched slightly, and he was the first to look away, lowering his head. "Your Excellency is right." He put his hand on his chest and bowed. "I was wrong." The frozen atmosphere suddenly dissipated, because Huaishur revealed a warm and genial smile, like the spring breeze. "What are you saying, Your Excellency? It was just a misunderstanding. How can there be any right or wrong?" He stood up, modestly helped the old snake orc up, took his hand, and said to the surrounding abyssal creatures, "What the revered elder said just now was right. I was not able to trust everyone, and made a mistake. In order to express my apology, just now, I specially went to the kitchen and personally made a dish for everyone. I hope that after everyone tastes it, you will be able to let bygones be bygones and forget these small unpleasantness. From now on, we will work together as one and work together closely. Victory in this war awaits us." Amidst Huaishur's impassioned announcement, the pale-faced Lin Shurjiu pushed a cart into the door. The stove on the cart was simmering big bone broth, which was already milky white and had an enticing aroma. The bones inside had long been stewed until they were soft and tender, and with a little poke with chopsticks, the meat on top fell off. It was obvious that the meat had been stewed into the broth. Huaishur took the bowl and ladle, and personally filled the bowl with fragrant meat broth for the revered elder. After sprinkling a handful of chopped green onions on it, the aroma could not be concealed, rising up even more. "Please, Your Excellency." Huaishur smiled and handed over the bowl. The revered elder was silent for a moment, then took the bowl with both hands, raised his head, and without caring that the hot soup was scalding his mouth, he actually swallowed it all. Even the bones were chewed in his mouth and swallowed into his stomach. After accepting Huaishur's kindness, everyone let bygones be bygones. The atmosphere became lively and peaceful again, and the dishes were quickly served like flowing water, pushing the atmosphere of the banquet to a climax again. During the banquet, Huaishur personally served everyone delicious broth. However, until the lid was closed again, no one saw what materials were used to make such a fragrant broth. It had to be said that it was really a pity. After Huaishur returned to his seat, he did not eat anything else. He just smiled, sipped the wine in his glass, and looked at everyone eating and drinking happily, looking extremely satisfied. It was as if he felt happy when everyone was eating happily. At the end of the banquet, Huaishur looked around at the hell crowd and asked thoughtfully, "Are you full? Would you like some more?" After receiving the reply, "Thank you for your hospitality. I'm already full." Huaishur nodded in satisfaction, raised his glass, and said, "Then, at the end of the banquet, let me toast everyone." As he said that, he took the lead to raise his wine glass, smiled at the others, and raised his glass. "May our friendship last forever." The wine, which was as clear as blood and had an intoxicating sweet taste, was drunk by everyone in one gulp. When Huaishur put down his wine glass, the originally lively and noisy hall fell into a sudden silence again. "Since we're full, let's get ready to set off." In the dead silence, it was as if they were bathed in the darkness of the night. Huaishur pulled out his sword and held it by his side. He calmly raised his head and announced to his subordinates, "Everyone, the time for war has come." Requesting monthly votes. Chapter 537. There was an awkward silence in the bridge of the iron crystal constellation. In the silence, everyone looked at each other in shock. They saw 100,000 question marks rising above each other's heads. They could not help but tilt their heads, unable to understand. What the hell? What was going on? What the hell was going on? Why did the old hen turn into a duck in the time it took to write a report for the ivory tower? Times changed too quickly. All the adults had the absurd feeling of seeing primitive people playing with nuclear weapons. They could not accept everything in front of them. They could not react at all. It could only be said that Weischer's actions were too fast, too ruthless, and too vicious. From the verge of chaos to everyone acting as if nothing had happened, only 15 minutes had passed. 15 minutes ago, everyone was still at daggers drawn and on the verge of a riot. 15 minutes later, everyone was happily drinking the soup. They sat together like brothers and shared the beautiful friendship that had lasted for a long time. It was still the same group of familiar actors, the same familiar venue, but the plot seemed to have taken the wrong script. It shocked everyone for an entire year, from the weak and easily bullied Si Jing to the fiery and fierce Feng Zhao. The seamless operation made everyone's eyes pop out. They originally thought that he had handed in a blank paper, but the exam was not over yet. How did he almost become a judge? Until now, it had been less than 3 hours since the end of the summoning. The originally restless and dangerous hell had been tamed and put on the shackles of the ivory tower. The traitorous ratmen who wanted to make money from both sides were ruthlessly dealt with by Weischer and ended up as baits. Meanwhile, the arrogant and untamable undead army of Nagas obediently lowered their heads under the pressure of the situation and tasted the bitter fruit of their carelessness. The gargoyles who tried to slack off and play tricks also received a warning under the cruel method of killing the chicken to warn the monkey. In the face of an everlasting friendship, the 3 groups of hell, each with their own thoughts, were forcefully united into one place. Then, before anyone could react, Weischer drew his sword and said that war was coming. So, the war came, even if it was so sudden. In this pitch-black night where danger lurked everywhere, Weischer didn't even wait for the dusk of the second day to arrive before he issued his first order as a commander with the ferocity of the banquet, set off immediately, disregarding the curse of the night, and rushed to the rescue of the isolated exploration team, and completely take down the sub-control device of hell. If he ate too much, he had to go out to digest it, to prevent any undue delay from causing more problems. After Weischer announced the plan, the entire hall once again ushered in a suffocating silence. Everyone looked at each other, feeling a burst of shock and uneasiness. However, due to Weischer's actions just now, they did not dare to directly oppose him. After a short silence, the elder stood up and asked, "Sir, where is the rescue team?" 700 kilometers away, in a complex industrial zone in the village of Dusk, Basement 4. If they set off from here, they would arrive in about 4 hours. If everything goes well, we can have breakfast there after everything is over. The elder pondered for a moment and said, "If there is no light source, our tribe may not be able to maintain its state under the curse." "That's easy. The light source has already been prepared for you. On the track of the transmission track, 4 huge iron boxes had been transported to the right side of the hall. After the iron boxes were opened, hundreds of hanging wind lanterns that had just come down from the assembly line were revealed in front of the large group of hell. A total of 970 alchemy wind lanterns, filled with the blessed ointment, is enough to support you for more than 2 hours. You don't have to worry about the curse," Weischer said. "As for the rest of the time, you don't have to walk, there is a driver." Following his words, outside the hall, a huge truck had quietly risen from the underground garage, lit up 2 blazing headlights, and pressed the horn twice. Raymond, the designated driver in hell, was already in place. The truck loaded with the precious depth balancer was enough to resist the erosion of hell in a short period of time, and after the alchemy modification and the changes of the border relics, the space in the cargo box of the giant truck had already expanded to the size of half a football field. It was enough to accommodate all the movements of the army here. Moreover, the largest gargoyles did not have to worry about the petrification curse at all, and did not need to occupy the internal space. All of this was prepared by the Abyss Rat Men and the Undead Snake Men. It had already been arranged clearly. At this point, what excuse did the respected elder have to refuse? Under Huaishur's gaze, the old snake man bowed. "As you command, Your Excellency. Then what about the gargoyles?" Huaishur turned his head and looked at the row of huge bat-winged demons. In silence, the leader of the gargoyles got up and saluted to Huaishur. "The war will come, Your Excellency," it said, "just as you wish." Things were decided like this. And when the bridge of the iron crystal seat finally reacted, even the noisy ratmen had already lined up to get on the bus. Only a mess was left in the hall. When Huaishur was about to get on the bus, Andrea descended from the sky with the red dragon's fire, a dazzling flame at his fingertips, and the flame wings slowly closed. She landed beside him. "Isn't it too risky?" she asked Huaishur. "It has to be risky." Under the faint light of the wind lantern, Huaishur glanced at the dark night in the distance. "We don't gamble, but the Ivy League has to. Since we can spy on their movements, they may not know nothing about us, especially the existence of the branch control center. The sooner we have it in our hands, the better. But your actions are too rash." Andrea conveyed the advice from the bridge. "At least you should bring the exploration team of the Iron Crystal Seat. If you are alone, there will always be accidents." "No, the exploration team must all stay." Huaishur said, "After I leave, the Iron Crystal Seat will enter the highest alert and be on guard against the attack of the Ivy League at any time. For the external forces, we will be enough for the time being. This is also why I advocated for a large group of people. The safety of the Iron Crystal Seat is the most important thing to ensure. Otherwise, if we are attacked, we will have no way out." Obviously, his refusal was also expected by the bridge. After Andrea nodded, he handed him something that looked like a remote control. "Bring this. You can use it to call for some long-range strike support. When necessary, you don't have to hide the location of the Iron Crystal Seat." "I will." Huaishur smiled slightly and put it in his pocket. He looked up and asked, "Is there anything else you want me to do?" "No, I am an amateur. How can a scholar compare to the rich experience of a judge?" Andrea looked behind him and said, "The great Grandmaster said that you can do whatever you want. No matter what, it's better than showing an unpleasant face in front of him all day." Huaishur was stunned and raised his eyebrows. "Am I annoying? No one likes a lion sitting in a cage." Andrea smiled and took a step back. He nodded and said goodbye. "Then, Mr. Chief, have a safe trip." Okay." Huaishur retracted his gaze and stepped on the escalator to the front passenger seat. The door closed. He stared at the endless surging darkness outside the window and chuckled softly. "Let's go," he said. "Let's go." Accompanied by the low sound of the gargoyles' bat wings flapping in the air, the huge truck roared and charged into the deep night. The blazing tail lights gradually went out. It was as if the sun had sunk into the fog. After a long period of drowsiness and pain, Pandalong opened his eyes and saw the pale ceiling of the ward. The life support equipment was making rhythmic sounds. "Who's there?" he asked. On the opposite side of the bed, there was a man holding a helmet sitting on a chair. He was wearing a thick, protective suit. His face was old and his hair was gray, but his blue eyes were like gemstones. It was difficult to shift one's attention from them. "Vice Principal, Michelle," he said, "the doctor told me that you will wake up soon. You are slower than I expected. How long have I been asleep?" Pandalong asked. Michelle said, "3 days. You are recovering well, but it cost a lot of money." Pandalong laughed. "I thought money was not a problem." "Money is not a problem. Time is." Michelle slowly got up and tossed the heavy helmet in his hand. The heavy sphere spun nimbly on his fingertips. He raised his head and told Pandalong, "We have to take action now. Otherwise, we'll lose everything we've invested." "Okay," Pandalong asked, "is there anything you want me to do?" "You will be in charge of the camp. The colonel will come with me." Michelle said, "In short, you need to take charge of the daily work and deal with the commissioners and accountants sent by the investors. If they are angry, let them be, but don't fall into the water or drown in the bathtub after drinking too much." Pandalong slowly propped himself up. "I will." Michelle nodded and turned to leave the ward. After passing through a long passageway and moving forward deep underground, the elevator went straight up and finally arrived at the huge underground hall. The colonel was waiting there with a heavy box on his back, smoking quietly. "Is everything ready?" Michelle asked. 12 large groups, a total of more than 4,000 hell creatures, ready for your command, sir. The colonel took off his hat and answered solemnly. Just behind him, the lights hanging high in the sky lit up for the first time with a low sound, illuminating the hell formation that was sleeping in the darkness. The monsters from the abyss raised their scarlet eyes and waited for orders. "Very good." Michelle calmly looked at the abyss army that stretched as far as the eye could see. He raised his hand and put on the heavy helmet. Since the establishment of the school, 120 years of unwillingness and patience, stepping on the hard work and effort of our ancestors, we have stepped on this thorny road. In the quivering silence, a certain part of Michelle lit up with a blazing flame. "This time, let's have a showdown with the ivory tower." Chapter 538. The silent night that had lasted for a long time was broken. It was as if an invisible force was violently stirring under the surface, setting off an undercurrent, making the silent night no longer silent. An ordinary night was no longer ordinary. Here, the world rotated eternally. The constant rotation between the rings made the terrain extremely changeable. Even a simulated map could not predict what would happen in the next round of changes. The longer one stayed here, the more one could understand the vastness and complexity of this hell. The entire Twilight Village was too big. Just the internal area was comparable to the size of Pseudo-Cheongjo. Countless machines that seemed to be out of control were still operating on their own after such a long time. Countless huge modules grew crazily regardless of the consequences, causing the entire Twilight Village to be in an eternal state of abnormal growth. The complicated underground structure, as well as the continuous rise and fall, expansion and contraction of the modules on the ground, completely turned this place into a maze. And the machines on the edge of the Twilight Village were still excavating and producing. The construction site, the expansion of the territory, and the embryonic form of the rings. The out-of-control von Neumann was like a machine constantly squandering its own productivity, creating ruins one after another. In the front passenger seat, Huaisher pinched his chin and looked at the dizzyingly complicated map on the screen. He then looked up at the messy route in front of him. He scratched his head and said, "Seriously, I think we need someone from Yuzhou to lead the way." "Yuzhou?" Raymond asked, "What is that place?" "It sounds very powerful." "Yeah, going in from the bottom, taking the elevator to the 16th floor, only to find that it was a basement, coming out from the top of the building and returning to the ground. walking for 80 kilometers. It's scary just thinking about it. Huaishir talked casually and looked down at the remote control in his hand. Pressing the green button would shoot out a laser, and pressing the red button, to be honest, he didn't dare to press it. But there was always a hint of eagerness to try. The description on the back cover was safe distance of 3 kilometers. If he didn't do it well, it would become a mutual destruction. It would be funny to think that they would be wiped out as soon as they went out. If news of his death spread, he was afraid that this year's Darwin Award trophy would be placed on his urn. It was better not to mess around. How much further? Huaishir asked. It's more than 50 kilometers now. According to the exploration team, the target area is very conspicuous and can be seen from a very long distance in the dark. Raymond's hand swiped on the interface, bringing up the reference of the straight line distance. Vision. Huaishir raised his head in confusion and stared into the darkness in the distance. It was so dark, how could he see anything? However, not long after, when the speeding truck passed through the underground tunnel and drove up the overpass, he caught a glimpse of the crimson sky behind the ruins of tall buildings in the distance. It was as if a volcano was erupting. Amidst the clouds, the gargoyle spread its giant bat wings and ascended. Soon, it sent a signal downwards. A large number of hellish hordes had gathered. Huaishir carried the wind lantern and flipped onto the roof of the carriage. With a wave of his hand, he threw out the rope of sorrow and tied it to the legs of the gargoyles. Then their strength rose into the air, and they looked towards the direction of the fire. They heard the roar of burning. A huge chimney, like a nuclear power plant, was releasing billowing smoke. In the chimney, dancing flames surged and gathered into a ferocious crimson that illuminated the night. In the reflection of the fire, shadows of complicated structures were thrown into the distance. Those dense chimneys extended from the ground like a jungle. Huge pipes ran through the countless jars like vines in an intricate manner. Even in the dark, there were still countless lights rising, illuminating everything. Huaishir put down the binoculars in disbelief. Was that an oil refinery? Before he could react, a roar suddenly erupted. The earth trembled. An oil storage tank was detonated. Airwaves spread. In the burned and broken tanks, boiling fuel poured out and flew up with the hurricane, forming a deadly storm. The fire was endless, falling from the sky. Countless mutants hidden in the surroundings were startled and screamed. These native creatures, who used the fire to avoid the curse of the night, felt the arrival of the crisis and screamed uneasily. As the oil splashed, a red signal flare rushed out of the sea of fire, rose into the clouds, and suddenly exploded, spreading out a dazzling high-frequency flash. That was the signal for help from the advance group. Then there was an ear-piercing sound spreading. In the boiling black clouds, a huge tentacle that looked like a ribbon slowly dropped down and caught the flashing signal flare. The tentacle contracted and easily extinguished the signal flare in the clouds. There was only a flash of light that outlined the silhouette in the clouds. Jellyfish. It was a jellyfish that was so huge that it was completely unreasonable. In the burning red smoke and clouds, it wriggled its canopy, swimming in the clouds that were as hot as a furnace like a fish in water. Tentacles slowly stretched out, climbed on the huge chimneys of the oil refinery, pulled out the towering chimneys like toothpicks, broke them, rolled them up, and threw them to other places. With continuous explosions, the center of the earth slowly collapsed, revealing the path to the inner layer. Countless shadows like black dots jumped into the cracks, and there were flames flickering in it. A large group of strange abyss arrived here. The war had already begun. It was even faster than Huaishir had expected. When Huaishir tried to connect to the exploration team's signal there, He could only hear static. There was no doubt that the Ivy League had blocked all the signals before the war started. They were too late after all. Huaisher returned to the car expressionlessly and said to Raymond, "Speed up." But there's no road ahead. The driver looked helplessly at the broken gap in the distance. "We have to go around from other places." "Why do we have to go around?" Huaisher turned back and asked, "Isn't the roof in front very spacious?" "Drive up, if you want to talk about this. I won't be sleepy." Raymond was stunned at first, then he smiled excitedly and rubbed his hands. Before he finished, he suddenly asked, "Hey, do you get carsick?" For some reason, looking at the man's smile, Huaisher actually felt a faint premonition of death. Wait, just as he was about to speak, he saw Raymondra pull down the red lever next to him. "Let's go." In an instant, dozens of seat belts ejected from the seat and firmly tied him to the passenger seat. Then, in the rear compartment, the depth balancer was overclocked, isolating all external influences and forming a temporary enclosed area. In the high-pitched sound of steel friction, the entire huge truck suddenly shook. After shaking off the heavy outer armor plate, from the end of the carriage, an engine nozzle that looked like a fighter jet was revealed. Ice blue flames were brewing in it and spewing out. A terrifying thrust erupted from it and spread out, giving the truck wings to fly. It spread out invisible wings and sped forward on the Dugga, causing a whistling sound. It rushed out of the Dugga fracture, trampled on gravity, and soared freely in the air. After the terrifying mass of hundreds of tons drew a jaw-dropping arc in the air, as the tail flame extinguished, it slammed heavily on the top of a tall building. Then, it tore through the ceiling and continued to fall in the roar. After smashing through 6 or 7 floors of ceilings, it finally stabilized in the ruins. As the tires began to rotate again, the collapsed debris was pushed away by the front of the truck. The fragile walls were torn apart by the giant beast's gallop. Dust flew, and the broken walls wailed. The tail flame spurted out again, pushing the truck through the obstacles of the building. After crossing a distance of dozens of meters, it plunged straight into the ruins of another tall building. It rushed out of the collapsed site and jumped onto another broken road. When it encountered a wall, it broke the wall. When it encountered an obstacle, it tore the obstacle. If it encountered a gap, it flew across the gap. Raymond whistled excitedly, turned the steering wheel, and stepped on the accelerator. The huge truck drifted in the air. It no longer cared about the road conditions or the surrounding scenery. They were heading straight for the oil refinery. Even if it was dozens of miles away, the roar of the truck's engine could be heard. It was the roar of the steel heart produced in the same batch as the fighter jet engine. It was like the exaggerated scene of man and car, as one in cartoons and manga. On the truck, there was a layer of source flame rising. As the wheels spun, streams of dazzling thunderbolts shot out, leaving behind a burning path. A giant beast resembling a rhinoceros rose from the flame, roaring with its head raised. Raymond's eyes were already like the headlights of a car bursting with a blazing light. Until now, Huaisher discovered that this guy was actually a knight in celestial genealogy, a level 3 sublimator of the Eternal Road, Gordium, named after the legendary chariot that humans offered to the god of sky and thunder. The one who untied the knot would dominate the fate of the world. The extended meaning was the one who controlled fate. Now, it was just like fate suddenly appeared. Without any warning, it fell from the sky. At this moment, the truck that had turned into a sky chariot spread thunder and fire, and its speed increased by several times. It was truly like lightning shuttling through the turbulent night. It tore through the layers of obstacles. Finally, it broke through the last high wall and charged head-on into the burning rainstorm that kept falling from the sky. With exaggerated tail swings and elegance, the rampaging truck set off a bloody storm in the crowd of hell. In just 4 minutes, the long distance that made people despair was crossed so easily. Then, dead silence suddenly came. The truck came to an abrupt stop. The doors slowly opened. In the reflection of the fire, a staggering figure walked out. When he landed, he didn't stand firm and almost fell to the ground. "Yo, hello everyone." Huaisher grinned and squeezed out a smile on his pale face. It was incomparably difficult. Then, facing the solemn array in front of him, he held his knees and suddenly bent down. Ugh. Chapter 5:39. Ugh. He vomited until he was in a daze. Huaisher didn't know how long he had been vomiting. He vomited until his stomach was empty, but he still couldn't help but feel nauseous and nauseous. Logically speaking, with the physique of a sublimator, he should be perfectly qualified for all the professions of ordinary people. He thought that he would have no problem even sitting in a NASA astronaut trainer and playing with a centrifuge. But now, Huaisher deeply felt that even a sublimator had a limit. He shouldn't be so arrogant as to challenge those professions and rules that he didn't understand. It was as if he had personally opened the bottle that sealed the devil. At this moment, his heart was filled with deep regret. What kind of crazy way of racing was this to make his eyes spin like a merry-go-round? If he had to make an analogy, it could only be said that he was tied up, stuffed into a cannon, and then shot out. Speeding forward in the screaming, he was ready to embrace the world in front of him at every moment and welcome the ending of being smashed to pieces. Even if Huaisher boasted that he was used to big storms, he couldn't withstand such an exciting event. Moreover, he was not in an isolated car tied to the passenger seat. It was fine when he was in the car, and he could barely restrain himself. But as soon as he got out of the car and stood on the ground, he immediately began to feel dizzy, and the dizziness that had accumulated along the way completely exploded. He vomited without warning. Originally, he should have killed him when he was at his weakest. This wasn't a cartoon for children. Magical girls couldn't hit people when they transformed. Around Huaisher, the dozens of strange, corrosive creatures didn't know anything about morality. When they saw the meat in front of them, they couldn't wait to open their mouths wide, take a deep breath of the sweet smell of the meat, and pounced on him. And then there was no more and then. When Huaisher looked up, there were only a dozen monster corpses lying on the ground in the restless field of fire. Some tenacious creatures were still spasming. From the swollen and broken skin, countless thorns and grass grew out in a mess, absorbing the life force of the abyssal species and growing vigorously. Sorry, I couldn't hold it in. Huaisher took out a pack of tissues from her pocket and blew her nose. Finally, she felt a lot more refreshed. Taking a deep breath of the pungent and dusty air, he apologetically said goodbye to the wriggling monster under his feet. He lifted his foot and stomped down. Crack! The whales were gone, and the world was quiet. Probably, other than the cries of the beasts in the distance, there was also the sound of explosions. The sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other was getting closer and closer, passing through the sea of fire and trampling on the shattered ground. A burly figure walked out of the flames. The curved horns inlaid with metal reflected a cruel flash in the flames. The earth shook again. Heavy swords that were difficult for ordinary people to wield were casually dragged in their hands. Sparks flew as the swords rubbed against the ground, and sharp sounds spread out. The thick and heavy armor with sharp edges and corners were covered with slashes from swords and sabers, but there was no expression on the face that resembled a bull's head. They were different from the ferocious beasts that were casually controlled. They were the real Abyss's Minotaur's warriors from the White Mane settlement. They were a famous army even in the Abyss. The moment the truck rushed into the fire, they had already noticed it. After a short period of time, they had already surrounded them, and the tight formation blocked their way forward. They were dozens of steps away from them and were waiting for them. It was not that they did not want to go forward, but they instinctively sensed the invisible boundary. Through the eyes that were different from other abyss creatures, they saw the ominous spreading from Huaishir's body. It was a horrifying scene that had almost condensed into a physical form. At this moment, an invisible disaster rose from Huaishir's face, limbs, and every part of his body, under the gazes of the Minotaur's warriors. A dark green color appeared. It permeated, spread, and stirred, forming a sea of poison. As he breathed, under Huaishir's feet, countless fine crystals grew out of thin air, intertwined, and multiplied, just like the crystals that grew in the mine. Once the shackles were released, the materialized toxins formed a jaw-dropping spectacle around Huaishir's body. As long as he maintained his breathing, it would bring about such a huge disaster. The power from the decaying dream caused the countless toxins in Huaishir's body to mutate wildly. Along with his origin substance, it created a dangerous zone. If I just stand there, I won't be able to earn money from my employer. Huaishir sighed softly. You're not coming? He took a step forward and walked through the poisonous crystals. With a wave of his hand, the sword of virtue grew from his hand. He swung it, drawing a sharp arc in the flickering flames. Then I'll go over. In his other hand, a burning banner appeared and fell to the ground, flapping in the scorching wind. Immediately after, countless clouds of fog spread out in all directions. The sacred burial ground descended here. The authority that belonged to the young judge of life operated in this dreamlike darkness, constantly eroding this hell and expanding her territory, gently bestowing fear, toxins, and nightmares to all living creatures. The war has begun, my friends. Huaishir raised his sword and pointed forward. Just as you wish. Along with his words, the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other came from the truck behind him. On the body of the truck, the armor plate suddenly lifted, revealing the iron light hidden in the cabin. The cover slowly rose, and the sharp hissing of the giant lizards burst forth. The undead Nagas, who had already gathered in formation, raised their eyes in unison. In the roar, the elder pulled the reins, and the giant lizards trampled on the ground. Then the cavalry formation galloped out like a flood. Behind them was a large group of abyssal rat men. These rat men held all kinds of weapons in their hands and screamed chaotically. They did not have the slightest bit of slyness and cowardice of the past. One charged faster than the other, as if they were on drugs. As long as the black shadows behind them pointed forward, it was as if they could not see the heavy swords in the hands of the Tauran warriors and their terrifying bodies that were taller than two of them. The legal department was the best warden. As long as a contract was signed, they could enforce it, wherever they were. The morale of these rat men was directly locked at full capacity, even if it only looked like it was full. Anyway, even if they were the last one to die, they would not run away. It had to be said that this kind of cheap tool, who would not feel sorry even if all of them died, was really useful. As Huaishir waved his hand, the group of rat men within the range of the bone burial sanctuary paused. The fur on their bodies hardened rapidly, and poisonous crystal clusters with sharp edges and corners grew from below. A large amount of toxins blended into the blood, quickly stimulating the secretion of hormones. The toxins, which could be used as stimulants and forbidden drugs, permeated the blood and spinal cord, causing their muscles to swell rapidly in an instant and enter a state of complete madness. For the stinky woman. The group of rat men panted violently, and a foolish smile appeared on their faces. One by one, they shouted some unknown words excitedly. Their eyes were red, and drooling, they pounced on the Tauren warriors. Then, the one who rushed at the front and the fastest was naturally cut into two by the giant swords that swept across. Juice splattered everywhere, and the death was too horrible to look at. It was a complete collapse. However, the Minotaurs did not have any complacency or joy. Instead, their expressions became more and more cautious. To say the least, killing these guys did not require any effort at all. But the problem was, what would happen after killing them? How were these rat men? They were clearly self-destructing bombs that pounced on them, the kind that was filled with poisonous water. It was not a matter of whether they could fight or not, but whether they were dirty and uncomfortable. But since the war had already begun, hesitation and cowardice were courting death. The Minotaurs were born with physique and resistance that were beyond the norm. Although the toxins were terrifying, they would not die in a short time. As long as they could get rid of them as soon as possible, they could buy time to inject the antidote and seek the antidote. Without any hesitation, the Minotaurs roared and quickly changed their formation. A few burly Taurens with large shields went to the front and formed an arrow formation. They ignored the attacks of the Ratmen and the undead army and turned to charge straight at Huaishur. Faster than them were the black shadows that swooped down from the sky. The gargoyle, that had been lingering for a long time, finally made its move. Its huge bat wings retracted as it swooped down and threw the javelins in its hands with the force of the dive. In the deafening sound, the javelins instantly penetrated the heavy shields and wedged deeply into the lungs of the Minotaurs. With a simple dive, the Taurens' counterattack was completely defeated. Immediately after, the Taurens' scattered formation was swallowed by the undead army. Although the difference in physique could not be ignored, the undead army that relied on mobility would not engage them head-on. After 2 rounds of throwing from afar, they pulled out their scimitars and charged forward. In just half a minute, the team of 40 Minotaurs, heavy infantrymen, was completely defeated. In the chaos, the leader did not give up. He picked up the large shield from his fallen teammate and forcefully resisted the charge of the undead army as he charged toward Huaishur. A terrifying weight of more than 400 kilograms trampled on the ground, causing a series of muffled sounds. The burly Tauren hid behind the large shield and charged toward Huaishur without regard for anything else. The iron wall pushed forward as the large shield rubbed against the ground, bursting into sparks. In the oncoming hurricane, Huaishur raised his hand and stabbed forward by a hair's breadth. The sword of virtue pierced through the steel and through the heavy shield, piercing the Tauren's flushed face with irresistible force, and came out from the back of his skull. Immediately after, the Tauren ran past Huaishur. The heavy shield brushed past the corner of Huaishur's clothes as it charged forward. After running for dozens of meters, it slowly came to a stop. It knelt on the ground and could not get up. Everyone, don't waste time outside. Go look for traces of the exploration team. I'll deal with that thing in the sky. Huaishur swung his hand and waved the blood on the blade. He raised his head and gave the order. The sharp sound of the flute burst forth. The roars of the mutants sounded again. The restless beasts noticed the situation here. The hunched flute players hidden among the beasts blew a few sharp notes, and the beasts that were attracted by the flute screamed restlessly. In the field of fire, the raging beasts suddenly turned back. More abyssal mutants that were attracted by the fire here were also immersed in the temptation of the flute and charged toward here without regard for their own safety. In the noisy noise, Huaishur's movements paused. He suddenly raised his head and looked above. There was a sharp iron light descending from the sky. Ambush! Chapter 540. He suddenly felt a sense of impending doom. In the darkness behind the distant flames, a figure crawled out from the collapsed frame and pulled the trigger at Huaishur. But in his hand, the beautifully carved musket didn't shoot anything at all. Only a piercing howl could be heard from the sky. A silver ray of light appeared like a star, locked onto Huaishur's head, and fell down. Border relic Damocles. It was a disaster weapon that summoned the blade of suspending ceiling. It ignored distance and bullet trajectory. As long as the mountain gazing on the gun locked onto the enemy's position and pulled the trigger, the weapon could descend upon the enemy's head. It chased after the enemy like a shadow, never stopping until the enemy was dead. In a short period of time, the sniper pulled the trigger again and again until most of the origin substance had been swallowed up by the Damocles. The blade of suspending ceiling quickly split apart, forming a spectacular meteor shower. As it fell, it grew rapidly, forming the embryonic form of the blade of destruction. Then, Huaishur raised his head and glanced at it. Everything came to an abrupt end. The sharp blade that had been born from the darkness had been destroyed in the darkness before it had even fallen. What the hell? The sniper raised his head in shock. He couldn't believe it. Through his scope, there was clearly nothing there. But in that instant, he caught a glimpse of a few flickering flames and dancing darkness. The darkness suddenly expanded, and then quickly closed, swallowing the blade of suspending ceiling. With the sound of metal shattering, the blade was strangled to death in its infancy. That something was there. Before he could react, the illusory, weak flames had already rushed towards him. There was a gust of wind. The sniper retreated without hesitation. He pulled on the hook, and his body quickly rose into the clouds. However, the camouflage suit he was wearing had already been sliced open. His bulletproof vest was also covered in cuts. Under the cuts, a wound opened up on his chest, dripping with blood. With fear and trepidation, he quickly rose. Behind the giant jellyfish hidden in the clouds, he used the light from the dozens of tentacles to finally see the invisible thing that had attacked him. The strange darkness revealed its ferocious appearance. The silhouettes of countless birds appeared in the ripples, as well as pairs of scarlet eyes. They were ghosts that resided in the darkness. They glanced indifferently at the attacker, who was hiding behind the jellyfish. They did not linger, and once again disappeared into the darkness. The dark windbreaker's innate ability was like a fish in water here. The darker the place, the more hidden their existence was. No matter what kind of observation method was used, it was difficult to see their bodies. When the fire illuminated everything, the Ean's soul naturally had nowhere to hide. However, the places where the fire couldn't reach were their hunting grounds. It was hard to see what had happened. However, the rapidly approaching beasts were constantly disappearing, as if they had been swallowed up by the darkness. It was so fast that only the ferocious cries of the crows could be heard. Only when the flickering candlelight flew by would the jagged bones and broken corpses be revealed. Its scarlet eyes flickered in the deepest darkness, spreading a vicious poison and nightmare, an unbridled tautai. In the end, even the intermittent whispers could no longer continue and abruptly stopped. Under the frenzied attacks of the abyssal rat men, the abyssal mutants scattered. The mighty crow tide swept through the fire field and finally showed its strange figure around Huaishur. It was as if black clouds had suddenly covered the earth. As Huaishur raised his hand, a crow with a candlestick in its mouth landed on his arm. It folded its wings that glowed with iron light and looked around with its scarlet eyes. Its gaze fell on the depths of the fire field. That was the biggest threat in the senses of the Een soul at this moment. Amidst the dancing crimson light, a figure wearing a cloak stood silently for a long time. It was still the gorgeous mask, the capable military uniform, and even the ancient military knife at his waist that he had seen before. His posture was tall and straight, like a nail being hammered into the fire, he was also looking here, quietly. "Colonel." Huaisher looked over, then looked around again. "You're the only one here?" "There's no need to look. I'm the only member of the troop here. I'm the one in charge here." The colonel's voice came from the flames, low and distant. He bowed slightly and greeted the young man standing in the darkness with his hand on his chest. "We meet again, Mr. Huaisher," he said. "I'm sorry that I didn't greet you properly before. If I had known earlier, the welcome ceremony last time would have been more solemn." Huaisher raised his eyebrows slightly. "Oh, have you inquired about me?" Under the mask, the colonel seemed to be smiling and said in a warm tone, as a competitor, "The star newcomer of the Ivory Tower should at least have some understanding, right?" "What a pity." Huaisher shrugged and continued to move forward. "I thought I would become a fan." Bang! A high-pitched chirp suddenly burst out, followed by a roar. Heavy arrows whistled through the air like a torrential downpour, nailing themselves in front of Huaisher with a buzzing sound. 41 heavy iron arrows that were half the height of a person had been deeply wedged into the cracked cement. What was more surprising was that the 41 heavy arrows could maintain a precise distance and angle between each other. It was as if an absolutely straight fence had grown out of the ground out of thin air. It stopped Huaisher 50 steps away from the colonel. "Just stand there. Don't come closer." The colonel raised his hand and said, "Sorry, I'm actually a Stockholmer. I'm a little autistic and not used to close contact with people." Observed Centaur Cavalry. The gargoyles' report came from the earpiece. "The number is about a company. There are more hellish groups inside, as well as a lot of engineering equipment." With the gargoyles' report, Huaisher also saw the vague shadows coming out of the fire, holding giant bows and aiming at him. The killing intent was piercing. Huaisher looked down at the boundary under his feet and raised his head to ask, "Where are our people?" The colonel looked back and called a figure over. After asking a question, he laughed softly. "They're still resisting underground, but they won't last long." Boom! As he waved his hand, the giant jellyfish in the clouds suddenly pulled out its tentacles from the ground. The tentacles that looked as soft as ribbons were pulling dozens of boulders that weighed hundreds of tons. With a casual swing, the boulders fell to the ground messily, and in the center of the oil refinery, a huge crack in the ground was pulled open again. Countless metal structures hidden underground were revealed. Like removing the shell of a machine, countless spinning or stuck gears were revealed in front of the jellyfish. It was complicated and difficult to start with, but now, under the jellyfish's tentacles, it began to violently smash all the obstacles and insignificant things, pry them open, and went straight to the core, the most important sub-control device. This was the proud creation of the Ivy League, and also a biochemical machine that was sold in large quantities in Hell as a military product. Ultra-heavy engineering chimera. Just one chimera was enough to replace dozens of huge engineering equipment. When necessary, it could even be used as a shield tunneling machine to carry out underground work and excavation. Under the operation of many different types of tentacles, the external defense of the oil refinery was easily dismantled. It could be foreseen that with such a huge difference in the number of enemies, the members of the exploration team, who lost the geographical advantage, could only shrink inwards. It was only a matter of time before they were completely defeated. "Mr. Huaisher, as a scholar, I don't want to have a conflict with others from the bottom of my heart. Even if I'm called a colonel, I'm actually an anti-war person. I've always been a pacifist. It's not my intention to meet on the battlefield. Work is work. I hope you can understand." The colonel suddenly raised his voice and suggested, "If it's possible, please stand there and wait for a while. After the excavation here is completed, will guarantee the safety of all your internal members and return them. I'll bet on the reputation of the Ivy League, and I'll make the above guarantee to you. If you surrender now, I can also guarantee your safety. I don't need the reputation of the Ivory Tower. I'll guarantee it for myself. If you don't surrender, I'll definitely cut off your head with this sword. Right here, right here. Huaisha raised the sword of virtue expressionlessly and asked, "What do you think of this proposal?" "Then I'm sorry. I really can't surrender, and I don't really want to die." The colonel sighed softly and waved his hand. "If that's the case, then there's only one solution." Following his movement, in the flames, a low roar burst forth again. Ferocious shadows slowly rose, gathered into a formation, and advanced forward. In the high-pitched sound of the horn, for companies, a total of 416 Minotaurs, heavy warriors, stepped on the fire and arrived. In this short gap, all of them were equipped with gas masks and goggles. A new layer of defensive coating was also plated on the thick armor, preventing the corrosion of the poison to the greatest extent. In the middle of the formation, the hunchback shamans supported themselves with crutches, splashing the blood in their leather bags. They chanted hymns and released the blessing from hell, causing their eyes to turn red and almost lit up with blood-red light. Under the mask, they exhaled scorching hot breaths. The iron hooves trampled on the ground, creating blazing sparks. Accompanied by a low sound that made one's scalp tingle, countless bowstrings were slowly tightened. The centaurs pulled back their giant bows and aimed at Huaisha and the large group behind him from afar. They were ready to attack. In a short silence, Huaisha reached out and took out the remote control that Andrea gave him from his pocket. He thought for a moment, looked up at the distance in front of him, and put it back. Although the firepower support from the iron crystal was convenient, the distance between them was too short. It was difficult to ensure safety, and at the same time, it was impossible to ensure that the branch control center would not be damaged. Unless it was to the extent of a life and death struggle, it was better to ensure the integrity of the strategic target first. Although the Lord of the Flies' destructive power was enough to be used in a one-on-one battle, in this kind of battlefield, the overflow damage to a single person could not form an effective AoE damage. It was a weapon that had been used once, so it was impossible for the enemy not to be prepared. Now, there were only 5 bullets left in the Judgment Mode magazine, and he could only replenish 1 bullet every 2 months. He had to use it carefully. Therefore, in the short silence, Huaisha suddenly raised his head and asked the colonel an unrelated question. "By the way, what day is it today?" Chapter 541. What day of the week? The colonel frowned, unable to understand this strange question. Because only in the present realm there was a 7-day week. Time was a very strange thing in hell. Generally, the further away one was from the present realm, the more erratic the stability and continuity of time would be. Unless there was a creator's framework connected to the Rainbow Bridge, which could be synchronized at any time, it was difficult to accurately determine the passage of time. And according to the calculations of scholars, in the area of depth 9, it was usually at a multiplier of 1. 34. In other words, 1. 34 days here was equivalent to 1 day in the present realm. He looked down at his watch. According to the conversion of the depth meter, the time of the present realm was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Monday. The colonel was stunned for a moment. He felt something furry pass by his feet. A soft tail rubbed against his leg, and he could feel the soft hair. Meow. On the ground, the little black cat widened its amber eyes and meowed at him in a childish voice. But the colonel retreated as if he was facing a great enemy. He felt a chill down his spine. When did this thing come to his side? Why did the refracting prism he specially prepared not react to the threat. Without thinking, he pulled out his precious gun, aimed at the black cat that was staring at him, and pulled the trigger. An entire magazine was emptied in the roar. Then, before the magazine fell to the ground, a new magazine was loaded. He raised the pistol again. All he saw was the mangled body of a black cat lying on the ground. He overreacted. Just as he thought so, he heard a soft voice behind him. Meow! He turned back in horror. In the gap between the fire and the darkness, he saw pairs of eyes slowly opening. Amber, calm and indifferent, staring at him. It meowed softly. Meow, and behind him, the body of the black cat quickly dimmed and disappeared, as if it had never existed. Only the bullet marks that had been shot into the ground remained. Drops of blood were left on the ground by an invisible thing, leaving a line of bloody cat paw prints on the ground. Meow, a brand new black cat, walked out of the void, looked back at him, and walked into the flames. More cats were squatting on the ruins of the oil refinery, on the steel frame, on the broken eye sockets, on the walls, on the ground, and in the ruins, wagging their small tails. His black fur reflected the light of the fire, turning red under the sun. There wasn't the slightest bit of awkwardness, as if they had always existed here. No, it should be said that they followed closely behind the Ivory Tower and the Ivy League. They walked on every corpse and every weapon, stepped on the murderous and cold eyes, and cried softly. Finally, at this moment, they revealed their appearance and declared their existence. Its name was War. Right at Huaisher's feet, a black cat sat upright, its tail swaying in the air as it observed everything that was about to be engulfed in flames and darkness. He waited obediently. Huaisher smiled and stretched out his hand. The roar was like thunder coming from the field of fire. Without any hesitation, along with the colonel's counterattack, 116 Centaur Rangers from the fertile land pulled the giant bows in their hands to the limit. In the crisp sound of steel and bowstrings bursting out, heavy arrows flew through the air. Armor-piercing heavy arrows soared into the sky and fell from the sky along with the scorching heat in the fierce wind. Iron rain covered the earth. And even faster than that was the strange, square frame that appeared on top of the black cat's head. The moment Huaisher reached out his hand, an invisible switch was turned on. Meow! It called out softly and stared at Huaisher. In the slender frame above its head, the 3 rows of diagrams began to spin rapidly. The sound of countless parts grinding against each other rang out from behind the frame, and sparks flew everywhere. In the whistling sound, the frame suddenly froze. The first to bear the brunt was the explosion of the totem, followed by 2 patterns that looked like burning blood droplets. At that moment, countless illusionary black cats suddenly collapsed and turned into smoke, enveloping Huaisher's group at a terrifying speed faster than arrows. Roar! In the crooked bodies of the ratmen, a loud roar that sounded like the roar of a giant beast sounded. A rain of arrows splashed down. When the scattered dust gradually dissipated, what was revealed were pairs of eyes burning with blood-red flames and bodies that seemed to be inflated with air. The abyssal ratmen, who could only exist as miscellaneous soldiers and cannon fodder in the abyss, had changed at this moment. In a trance, people almost thought that they had encountered the legendary crown wearer, the White Tent Lord, and the Corpse Forest Lord's Legion of Fanatics, the Black Death Army. They were not inferior to those stitched-up giant rats that had been transformed by forbidden drugs and surgery when the abundant blood energy propped up their curled backs. On their swollen muscles and bodies, blue and purple capillaries appeared under the black and shiny hair. Even the poison crystals embedded in his body started to show traces of blood red. It made people wonder if these rat men would explode like balloons if they were poked with a needle. In the literal sense, The blood that was close to boiling ran through their bodies, bringing thousands of times more pain and unimaginable power at the same time. Under the enhancement of hormones and status, all their minds had fallen into a frenzy, and they could not feel this insignificant pain at all. Even if they were pierced by an iron arrow from the sky, they would pull it out indifferently and throw it on the ground, allowing blood to gush out of the wound that pierced through their abdomens. At this moment, the role of the legal department was completely different. They were no longer forcing them to charge with the law. Instead, they were forcing them to wait for Huaishi's order and stay where they were. They were not in a hurry to rush up and arm wrestle with the fully armed Tauren warriors. You're not even as tall as their shoulders. Even so, their bloodshot eyes were already occupied by brutality and madness. They could not wait to throw themselves into the battlefield. Even Huaishi did not expect that the enhancement of war and peace would be so exaggerated. No, it should be said that the original quality of the Ratmen was too weak, which was why they were so crazy under the buff of war. This time, he was quite lucky. Although he did not draw the same 3 prizes from war, the result was still above average. In addition to the urge to reinforce, which strengthened explosive power during encounters, he also randomly drew double blood fever, double fury, and enhanced recovery speed. Compared to the Ratmen who had been reborn, the gargoyles did not change much. However, the ferocious aura on their bodies could not be suppressed and spread out. It was as if they had truly transformed from stone statues into demons. The lizard mounts of the Naga undead army had turned purple-green. They were breathing heavily from their noses and neighing loudly and sharply. Even with the knights pulling the reins, they could not resist the urge to glance at the creatures. "Your orders, Your Excellency." The Naga undead elder spoke in a hoarse voice. He still managed to control himself despite the fanatical impulse. "Orders?" Huaishi thought for a moment and chuckled softly. "To be honest, I don't understand battle tactics and the way of war. You are the real professionals. However, since the war has begun, there will only be one order." He raised the sword of virtue in his hand and pointed at the steel formation that was advancing toward him. He gave his only order: "Please bring me victory." "As you wish, Your Excellency." The undead elder bowed. At that moment, the last restraint was released. All the berserk Ratmen roared. They held their crude axes and spears and madly charged toward the Minotaur's formation. They actually withstood the countless arrows that fell from the sky and charged toward the iron wall that had no gaps in between. Even faster than them were the gargoyles that rose to the sky and descended from the sky. At this moment, when the gargoyles that were more than 3 meters tall folded their bat wings and descended from the sky, they turned into genuine weapons of mass and caused a huge uproar. As the earth shook, they kept their throwing spears and pulled out their long halberds in close combat. They opened and closed in the Minotaur's formation, and for a moment there was a continuous roar. With the power of more than a dozen gargoyles, they actually managed to open several tragic gaps in the defense of the Minotaur's heavy armored company. Then the Ratmen, who had fallen into a frenzy, clamored and pulled the other party into a long entanglement. There was nothing they could do, even with the help of the war halo, which was endowed with extreme explosive power, double the fanaticism, and HP regeneration. The crude weapons in the Ratmen's hands were still not enough to break the excellent defense of the Minotaur's warriors. And this group of Tauren warriors who had received war training since young were all skilled warriors. Although the fanaticism made up for the lack of fighting spirit of the Ratmen who had always relied on numbers to fight could not compare to the quality of the individual soldiers. Under the skillful cooperation, even if the Ratmen, who did not care about their own safety, charged into the gaps, they would still suffer tragic losses under the skillful cooperation of the Minotaurs. Even if they could still get up after being slashed twice and their intestines were pierced, they would still die after being slashed twice more. Now, they were only relying on their own numbers to force a stalemate. If it were before, with the terrible morale of this group of rat men, they would have collapsed long ago. How would they be able to maintain the current balanced situation? If they really wanted to break through, they still had to rely on the elite gargoyles that broke into the formation. The undead army first launched 2 rounds of projectile fire from the flanks. Unfortunately, it did not create much of an effect before the heavy armor. The revered elder decisively changed his target. He put away his bow and arrows, pulled out his saber, and urged the berserk lizard to charge toward the centaur company that had finished assembling. Chow Lu, while galloping, the revered elder roared, "Hold the flag for me!" The strong deputy screamed and snatched the undead army's flag from the original flag bearer. He increased his speed and followed closely behind the revered elder. He raised the flag high and conveyed the revered elder's orders. 400 steps. Full assault. Chapter 542. When the centaur commander saw the undead army's attack, he sneered and waved his hand. All his subordinates instantly abandoned their arrows and drew their swords. Instead of retreating, they quickly gathered and raised their iron hooves to charge at the undead army. Peers looked forward to their peers dying. The centaurs and nagas were both famous in the abyss, and they were both adept at cavalry battles. The grudges between the centaurs and nagas were enough to fill an entire library. Why would there be a need for them to announce their names? Just do it and be done with it. This group of naga, who usually only knew how to sit on their close relatives and shoot arrows from the back, had lost their minds. Light cavalry charging towards heavy cavalry in full armor? If they want to die, I'll grant them their wish. H. As the centaurs roared, the ground trembled once again. The crimson centaurs gathered and launched a counterattack against the undead army. In the blink of an eye, 300 steps. With the great eyesight of the abyssal mutants, the centaur leader could see the gap in the scales on the elder's face. In the past, the centaurs would swiftly turn and take a detour at this distance to restrain the enemy. But this time, the centaurs didn't slow down at all. In fact, they were still advancing. 200 steps, 150 steps. Under the command of the centaurs in the front row put down their spears in unison. A sinister smile appeared in their eyes under their iron helmets. Speed up, 100 steps. They couldn't dodge any more. In this narrow and almost insignificant distance, the elder at the front suddenly opened his mouth and roared. Then he reached into his leather pouch. Together with everyone else, they pulled out a flintlock pistol with the emblem of the ivory tower engraved on it from their leather pouches and aimed it forward. The centaur chieftain's eyes widened as he fell into a state of shock. Damn it! What the hell are you holding? 50 steps. At this distance, they couldn't dodge anymore. A sinister smile appeared on the serpent's face as he pulled the trigger. Times have changed, chieftain. Along with a loud boom, white smoke spurted out from the crude flintlock pistol. This kind of explosion that relied on alchemy gunpowder wasn't stable, and some of the pistols had even exploded. However, most of the flintlock pistols completed their mission when they were about to be scrapped, shooting out deadly bullets from them. In an instant, the centaur's formation shook. Along with a loud boom, countless centaurs staggered and came to a sudden halt. The formation was in chaos. Under flag bearer Chow Lu's roar, all the nagas abandoned their guns and raised their sabers. The blades clashed. After a clash, the chieftain's head fell from his shoulder. The venerable elder didn't even look back as he continued forward. The Naga's charging formation instantly split into two sides, seizing the opportunity to deal damage. Following that, the Naga's formation regrouped amidst the raging flames, and once again charged towards the centaurs who had fallen into chaos. "Kill these bastards!" The elder roared and raised his saber. More than 80 undead knights followed, closely behind, and charged at the centaurs, who were in a chaotic formation. However, the final outcome had already been decided the moment the flintlock pistol was fired. With the technology of the ivory tower and Weischer's batch of degraded metal explosives, it was easy to use alchemy to recreate the flintlock pistol in hell. But in reality, if it was only at this level, it was insignificant. In terms of lethality, the metal bullets couldn't even compare to the centaur's heavy arrows from a distance. There were very few guns that could be used in hell, and with the absurd physique of hell's creatures, a bullet wound was nothing. Even if one used a Thompson gun on a gargoyle, it wouldn't be of any use. There were many races that were born with bulletproof vests. In the end, the lethality of this thing didn't rely on its design. It was the shock it could cause when the enemy was caught off guard, and the unknown after pulling the trigger. These **king bastards even have guns. What if they throw a grenade? The roar that burst forth from the Minotaur's formation in the distance and the flames that soared into the sky perfectly confirmed this conjecture. This group of bastards really had lightning in their eyes. Not only do they have grenades, but they also have explosives and incendiary bombs. Weischer's exclusive patent, the Alchemy Explosive V4. Zero and the metal incendiary bomb Ramesh's Wrath were refined 3 times in a row. Using this kind of weapon at close range could be considered a mutual destruction weapon. Once they encountered the fearless rat men, it was like meeting the golden wind and morning dew. It was even better than meeting countless humans. The excited rat men braved the explosion and pounced into the formation with bloodshot eyes. Then they suddenly fell to the ground. It was like kowtowing for red packets during the new year, offering a big gift. Brother and sister-in-law, Happy New Year. As the blazing flames slowly rose from the Minotaurs, a hot wind filled with the pungent smell of metal blew in their faces. Weischer propped herself up with her sword and stood in place, bored to death. She quietly watched the battle. He stared at the colonel in the depths of the oil refinery. The colonel also looked at him silently. His palm repeatedly rose and fell on the military knife, clenching and releasing it, but he never unsheathed it. He hadn't made up his mind. In the dancing firelight, the shadow on his mask constantly changed, flickering between light and dark. Looking at Weischer's eyes, he slowly became disappointed. In the end, the other party didn't use the terrifying weapon that instantly injured Pan DeLong. Although he didn't know if there were restrictions, or what if he let the other party continue to blow up like this, even the Minotaur's heavy armor company, which was famous for protracted and defensive battles, might not be able to withstand it. He was still hesitating. Just like that, in front of him, Weischer raised his hand. The darkness in the burial sanctum surged and almost boiled. Then countless blood-colored crows emerged from it, spread their wings, and rose into the sky. The crimson torrent swirled above the sky. Under the attack of the war, it was the crows of ghosts that had really transformed. In the dim light of the candlelight, they fiercely spread their wings and swooped down. When the blade-like wings swept past, even the heavy armor of the Minotaurs couldn't resist. A total of 1,264 crows suddenly descended. They didn't really rush into the battlefield. They swept past the chaotic battlefield and then rushed to the huge jellyfish in the sky. In the scorching clouds, the huge jellyfish suddenly shook. Among the hundreds of tentacles, dozens of them were raised and swept around randomly, but they couldn't touch the invisible crows. When the crows flew, they would release the bombs between their claws, leaving a cluster of explosive flames on the huge canopy of the jellyfish. After 4 or 5 consecutive explosions, the jellyfish's canopy was still intact and didn't fall apart as expected. After the translucent jellyfish's body surface broke, a large amount of cooling liquid that was on the verge of boiling spurted out from below. It was difficult to cause effective damage, but it successfully interfered with the giant evolved chimera's work. On the back of the jellyfish, the gunman who had attacked Huaisher tried to fight back. Soon, as the crows spread, a middle-aged man with a solemn face in a black robe appeared on the jellyfish's canopy. "Holy!" Van Helsing raised his eyes and murmured fanatically. The axe of wrath in his hand lit up with a blazing light. He stepped forward. The sound of air breaking broke out. Van Helsing ignored the blade of extermination falling from above his head and came in front of the gunman. The burning axe blade slashed down with a thunderous sound. The gunman only remembered to pull out his dagger and tried to block, but then the broken dagger fell from his body along with half of his arm. Blood gushed out. The gunman quickly retreated, trying to avoid it, but he couldn't escape Van Helsing's speed. The former executioner of the religious court of inquiry followed him like a shadow. If he couldn't even deal with a gunman at such a close distance, he wouldn't be called an ace purifier. The gunman couldn't retreat. Without hesitation, he jumped off the back of the jellyfish and fell to the ground. But in midair, Van Helsing's face was already close. Several falling blades penetrated his body from the back, but there was still no expression on his solemn face. Instead, he raised the axe in his hand again and slashed down. Blood sprayed out in midair. Only a broken body fell to the ground, along with the broken border relics. Even with the protection of protective equipment, it was still difficult to be whole like a lump of rotten meat. Soon after, the severed head fell to the ground beside the colonel's feet. The colonel glanced down at the face. In silence, he raised his foot and kicked it away. He pulled out his sword and pointed it at Huaisher's face. He issued his challenge. Huaisher was expressionless and unmoved. It was as if he didn't see it. He couldn't be bothered. As a result, the eyes under the mask became increasingly gloomy. As he slashed down the blade, a cold shadow appeared in the flames behind the colonel. The colonel's clone and soldiers descended again, but this time their attire was completely different from his. They no longer maintained the ancient attire from decades ago. Instead, they were elite soldiers with masks and helmets, dark camouflage uniforms, and bulletproof vests. In addition to the modern firearms in their hands, there were grenades at their waists, magazines hanging from their bodies, and even grenade launchers, mortars, and anti-aircraft rocket launchers. All kinds of weapons were available. Under the miraculous blessing of the stigmata, they weren't affected by hell at all. The total number of soldiers was more than 60, almost equivalent to an entire special operations force. At this moment, the colonel's title was truly worthy of his name. At this moment, the quiet night sky outside the oil refinery was broken by a roar. A blazing beam of light suddenly rose from the distance and swept across the night sky, shooting toward the other side of the village of dusk. It vaguely illuminated the outline of a giant ship. Then, the tail flames of countless missiles completely lit up the night sky. On the ground, countless flames sprouted and grew rapidly, bringing with them thick smoke and vigorous air waves. That was the direction of the Iron Crystal Constellation. Huaisher calmly glanced back, unmoved. There was the Iron Crystal Constellation, the Grand Master guarding it, and the assistance of so many scholars, alchemists, and the ascendants of the exploration team. If the Ivy League really attacked, he would cut off his head on the spot. Huaisher still didn't know where he was most confident now. There was no other word, the Grand Master. As long as the Grand Master was still there, There was absolutely no possibility of the Iron Crystal constellation falling. Huaishur would have an absolutely safe rear and wouldn't have any worries. But now it seemed that the branch control center here had become a trap used by the Ivy League to lure the Ivory Tower's troops. He grinned and gave the colonel a mocking smile. Chapter 543. How pitiful! Huaishur looked at the colonel and asked sympathetically, "Were you thrown out to be an abandoned pawn?" An important sign of being an adult is learning to take responsibility. The colonel responded indifferently, "Since it's a job, then no matter how bad the task is, you have to do it well. Kid, you're still far from it." Suddenly, a personal attack was launched. Huaishur raised his eyebrows, but he didn't feel angry. In any case, the fact that the colonel was standing here meant one thing. He came here prepared to die. He wanted to entangle the main force of the Ivory Tower with his own strength and create an opportunity for the Ivy League to fight back. In order to win, he was willing to play his role in this round of exchange. This determination and courage were truly admirable. Unfortunately, whether it's here or the Iron Crystal Throne, you won't get either. Huaishur finally pulled out the blade from the ground, took a step forward, and walked out towards the colonel. "You were challenging me just now, right, Colonel?" "Then wait there for a moment." Huaishur walked straight ahead, ignoring the fierce battle that separated them from each other. "I'll respond to you immediately." Casually, he nailed the flag of the burial sanctum to the ground behind him. Huaishur walked forward step by step. The chaotic rat tide opened up in front of him. The furious Minotaurs, warriors, waved the giant axes in their hands and roared as they rushed towards him. In his hand, the projection of the Sword of Virtue dissipated and was replaced by the ferocious hammer. The fire of agony burst out from the spit. As Huaishur turned around, the hammer swept horizontally. Thunder spread, followed by a loud sound of crushing iron light, and moved forward with irresistible force. The giant axes were crushed like thin paper, and the remaining force smashed forward. Waves of air burst out, and the burly, heavily armored warrior was sent flying backwards, shattering into pieces in midair. Scarlet blood rain, and iron shards shot out behind him, creating a terrible gap in the defense line. Huaishur had already stepped into the center of the battlefield and casually put the sacrificial knife into the throat of the heavily armored warrior in front of him. Blood gushed out from the gaps between the thick and heavy pages. Before it fell, Huaishur had already leaped up, stepped on its shoulder, and leaped with all his might. Along with the spreading shadows, the crow tide descended. The blood-red crows cawed fiercely, showing their scarlet eyes to the Taurens and sweeping their iron wings. As the crimson crows gathered and dispersed, Huaishur suddenly crossed the large group of crows and appeared in their center. He raised the axe of wrath and slashed at the defenseless minotaurs around him. Thus, a bitter battle began. Huaishur walked forward step by step. The colonel stared at all of this coldly, quietly waiting for Huaishur to break through the encirclement step by step and arrive 100 meters away. Without needing him to wave his hand to give the order, the army composed entirely of clones took a step forward, looked down from the burning field of fire, and pulled the trigger at Huaishur. Without the slightest delay or oversight, the perfect crossfire net instantly drowned Huaishur's location. The moment the steel rainstorm pulled the trigger, destruction descended. Huaishur's shadow was instantly torn apart, but Huaishur immediately appeared in the crowd on the right, as if he had teleported. Then countless afterimages spread out. In the chaos, dozens of afterimages that were indistinguishable from each other flew toward them in a disorderly manner. The minotaurs roared and bravely blocked in front of the afterimages, disregarding their lives to keep the enemy in place. But then the howls of the gargoyles descended from the sky. As early as the moment Huaisher stepped into the battlefield. All the gargoyles quickly retreated at the sound of the leader's horn. They gathered in the direction of Huaisher and followed him to launch a surprise attack at the colonel's location. They even raised their bat wings to block the crisscrossing bullets for Huaisher. Behind the colonel, the cold light reflected by the lens flashed and disappeared. There was a thunderous explosion. A hole suddenly appeared in the chest of a gargoyle. It penetrated from the front to the back and fell to the ground. Sniper, ignoring the spears that shot at him from behind, the sniper skillfully moved his position in the darkness, raised the muzzle again, aimed at the chaotic battlefield, and pulled the trigger. Another Huaisher's afterimage exploded. This time, he couldn't dodge the spears of the gargoyles. He flew backward and was nailed to the wall. But the sniper's figure quickly dissipated, and a brand new clone walked out of the darkness, took the rifle he left behind, and began to attack again. When the soldiers of an entire legion were controlled by the same will at the same time, the cooperation displayed reached a perfect level, and there were no flaws in the perfect execution of the colonel's orders. Before becoming the colonel of the troop, he was a real active colonel of the American City-State Alliance, a tactical instructor at the Army Officer Academy, and a well-deserved weapon of war. The rich experience of more than 16 local wars and hundreds of special missions, and even more suppression operations against ascendants created a perfect counterattack strategy at this moment. They even broke through the opponent's suppression and began to counterattack. Young Master Ming's afterimages had long been within the plan. Although the number of afterimages exceeded expectations, it was still within the scope of the plan. As long as they suppressed him with firepower, sooner or later he would be forced to, at that moment. Huaisher's figure suddenly flashed in front of him. The sword of virtue slashed down. That kind of unreasonable speed was simply too exaggerated. The double acceleration of Yu's step allowed him to cross a distance of 41 meters in an instant. Huaisher was already in front of him. The heavy anti-explosion shield was instantly shattered into pieces, along with the clone holding the shield behind it. Huaisher's figure turned in the air without any reason, as if he didn't care about inertia, bypassed the heavy obstacles, aimed at his face, and slashed down with the blade. Behind the colonel, the two half-kneeling clones raised their hands at the same time and pulled the trigger. The radiance of the spear of compassion surged, and the blade of the spear left their hands and flew towards him. The colonel held his breath, pulled out his sword to block the tip of the spear, and avoided the poison recorded in the intelligence report. But when he retreated, Huaisher's figure suddenly closed in, and the sword of virtue stabbed out again. Faster than that, the soldier who rushed forward pressed the hot barrel of the gun against the back of Huaisher's head. The trigger was pulled, and the bullet whistled out. At that moment, Huaisher's figure mysteriously disappeared from the spot. Missed. The cold blade moved forward, leaving a hole in the military knife's body, and like a hot knife through butter, it nailed into the colonel's chest. The colonel reached out his hand indifferently and grabbed Huaisher's wrist tightly. Drummer! In the explosion, his fingers shattered inch by inch, and the cold blade of the sacrificial knife was already pressed against his neck. Behind the mask, the colonel raised his eyes and stared at the young man who was surrounded in front of him. The soldiers who were waiting around had already aimed their guns at Huaisher, who was close at hand. There was no blind spot, and even the colonel himself was within shooting range. In the sky, the huge jellyfish suddenly shook, and the body under the jellyfish's umbrella suddenly opened, and a heavy barrel stretched out from it, aiming at where they were below. Fatal fire was brewing in it. "General, Huaisher," the colonel said arrogantly. "Are you sure?" Huaisher was amused. She looked around and said, "You think you can keep me here with just a few guns? Or do you think I can protect you?" The colonel responded indifferently, Please rest assured, I am ready to die together with you. But I haven't, Huaishur said helplessly. I still have an enviable youth and a long time to squander, and many dreams that may be impossible to achieve. I can't, and I shouldn't die here. Are you begging for mercy? No, I'm just explaining a principle. I didn't come here to die with anyone from the beginning, and I will never die here. Huaishur calmly stared into his eyes as if he was telling a truth and told him, So, next, I will kill you, and then turn around and go back. With his words, an unexpected roar suddenly broke out in the distance. The blazing light suddenly gathered into a beam and spewed out from the furnace that had been brewing for a long time, tearing the night sky above the fire field, and also penetrating the jellyfish in the clouds with irresistible force. In the sky, the jellyfish wailed and twisted its body, but it couldn't escape the fate of death. It faced the earth. With a large amount of cooling liquid spurting out of its body, the overloaded heat began to burn its body in the air. In the end, only hundreds of burning red steel parts fell to the ground with flying ashes and wreckage, and smashed into the fire field. Just outside the battlefield, a truck that had long been forgotten by everyone finally showed its ferocious claws and teeth. When the phantom camouflage was removed, with the splitting and opening of the carriage, countless complicated structures quickly changed. Under the hydraulic drive, another set of structures hidden under the body of the car began to operate. The 16 wheels quickly retracted and were replaced by 3 huge bases that were deeply nailed into the earth. When the cumbersome carriage fell off, a huge cannon that was enough to make people stare at it with their mouths agape rose from the body of the car. Countless alchemy arrays and runes shone on it, and with the surging of the source substance, Gordium, the master of fate, arrived here. After seeing the actual situation of the place, it seized the opportunity created by Huaishur, and the huge cannon aimed at the sky, shooting out thunder and fire that determined the outcome. The final word. This is a warning from the Ivory Tower. Please stop all acts of war and surrender immediately, or in 10 seconds, we will launch a saturation artillery attack on you. On the control panel, Raymond announced indifferently, counting down 10, 9, 8, 7. Are you stupid, little brother? I have a cannon. Not only was the colonel dumbfounded, but Huaishur was also dumbfounded. Wait, why do we have a cannon? Aren't you a driver? So are you a F***king driver of a carriage-mounted cannon? It was as if he suddenly found out that the driver he found was a train driver, but he also drove a train cannon. It shocked Huaishur for a whole year. The story of Lu Chuan, who had an item store on him, gradually went astray and became a system merchant in order to make money 2 million high-quality authors' new book, Guaranteed Character. Chapter 544. With Raymond's bombardment, this sudden war finally came to an end. Even so, Huaishur's forces were still unable to stop the colonel and his men from retreating. If possible, Huaishur really wanted to kill them all and leave them here forever. However, from the beginning of the war until now, he had felt a faint sense of impending death from the colonel's body. To be safe, he did not use the Fly King, who had been eager to fight, but it was hard to know what else the other party had. Therefore, although it was a pity he could only let them go, Huaishur looked at the colonel's neck that disappeared into the darkness and could not help but sigh regretfully. They won, but he felt that something was missing. Soon, he began to have a headache. The price of fighting too hard was that he had to endure the painful results when counting the losses. The gargoyle had slightly injured 3 people and severely injured 1, but the wound in the chest was nothing to the gargoyle. After removing the curse on the bullet, it ate a lot of metal and rested for about a week. The undead army had slightly injured 11 people, severely injured 6, and lost 3 people. It was still within the acceptable range. This group of Nagas became the undead army because of their strong vitality. As long as they still had a breath left, they could undergo a ritual to shed their skin and get out of danger. Moreover, with the medical staff of the Ivory Tower here, there were basically no major problems. In the Naga's mind, there was no such thing as death. They had special glands in their bodies that could store memories. As long as the body was recovered, the glands would be immediately preserved. After bringing it back to the tribe, through the hands of the great shaman, the precious experience and memories could be recovered from the body of another member. They were not sad or afraid of death. Instead, they were filled with the literal cruelty and indifference of cold-blooded animals. As long as the sacrifice was worthwhile, they would not care. But the rat men were miserable. Although they had strong vitality, they did not have the incredible talent of shedding skin and regenerating like the Nagas. It was already extremely lucky that nearly 300 of the 800 rat men had died. Most of them did not even have bones left. As for the severely injured ones, who knew how many of them were saved by the members of the legal department with the first aid equipment given by the Iron Crystal Base, these were all precious cannon fodder. If he brought them back and modified them, they could still be used again. In any case, these ratmen's lives were ridiculously tough, and they did not have any rejection reactions. Everyone could put together the pieces through crowdfunding and continue to be alive and kicking after the surgery. In fact, the most famous death squad among the rat men was made up of veterans who had undergone several suturing operations. As for their next transformation, Huaishur already had some ideas and ideas. He could go back and talk to the alchemists. Huaishur's own flock of crows had nothing much to say. As long as the Cage of Dreams still existed, losing members was not a problem at all. Moreover, they did not suffer any losses. After this battle, they seemed to have matured a little. At least, that was what the young Arbiter Ming's divine mark felt. There were still some gaps before it could truly become a large group, but these could all be carefully studied tomorrow. Now, the problem that made Huaishur the most unhappy was in front of him. Raymond was eating the instant noodles that had just been cooked in hot water in the truck. He looked at him blankly. "Why are you looking at me like that? Did I do something unnecessary? Why didn't you use the cannon earlier?" Huaishur rolled his eyes. "You didn't give the order. I thought you had other plans. In the end, you really didn't know." Raymond shrugged shamelessly. After seeing the unhappy look in Huaishur's eyes, he could only put down the instant noodles and sigh. It was just a joke to liven up the atmosphere. Don't be angry. To be honest, when I first installed this thing, I didn't think it would be useful. It was just an emergency. As he spoke, he opened the door behind him and showed Huaishur the fuel meter of the truck. "Do you see it? I sped all the way here and only burned less than 1% of the fuel. The cannon just now even burned out the alchemy fuel in my 2 auxiliary fuel tanks. This truck's current model only allows me to carry goods. If I really rely on it to fire a cannon, what's the use of one shot? And it takes 5 minutes to warm up. I can't ask you to find a way to attract the firepower and create an opportunity for me, right?" As the door opened, the smell of burnt dashboard rushed into Huaishur's nostrils. It was so hot in the driver's seat that one could steam a steamed bun. Raymond's noodles were cooked on the steering wheel. Huaishur suspected that the cannon didn't even have a cooling system installed. "You see?" Raymond sighed. "The mission given to me by the principal is to be able to take you away at a critical moment. What happened just now was already my own decision. Don't talk nonsense. I still have more than 20 loans to pay for my truck. If my salary is cut, I'll be screwed. Come, eat noodles." As he spoke, he very skillfully served a bowl of noodles to Huaishur. He even added an egg on top and asked him to pretend that nothing had happened. This overwhelming feeling of being a social animal actually made Huaisher feel a little nostalgic. He wondered how the good brother in the gray suit was doing now. He hadn't seen him since they parted on the Stellaris. If he had known, he would have left his contact information, and by the time Huaisher realized that he had been fooled, he had already finished the bowl of noodles. Raymond came over with the soup pot with an enthusiastic look on his face, as if he was ready to make more if he didn't have enough. Huaisher really wasn't in the mood to pursue the matter of this son of a bitch slacking off. Besides, this guy had already confessed his identity. Huaisher had to give Russell face no matter what. In order to repay his teacher's love and care, he could only return the favor by swiping his credit card a few more times. He put down the bowl and walked into the crack under the refinery. After 10 minutes or so, they finally verified the sequence codes with the members of the exploration team in the underground fortification and confirmed each other's identities. When Huaisher went down, she was almost mistaken for an enemy and shot to death. It wasn't until now that the ragged iron door at the end of the corridor that was covered in traces of fire and explosions finally opened slowly. Ogiest, half of his face burnt black, was standing behind the door. When he saw that it was Huaisher who walked in, he breathed a sigh of relief and put down his gun. He slumped in the corner, unable to get up. There were a total of 16 people in the 2 exploration teams defending here, and they actually resisted the Ivy League's fierce attack. The power of a few border relics naturally played a role, but basically everyone here was injured. The most seriously injured Ogiest even made people wonder how he still had the strength to stand up. "Don't move first." Huaisher bent down and checked the wounds on his body. First, he used the silver blood potion to seal the most tragic external injuries and treated them urgently. Finally, he transferred the power of the mountain ghost to restore him and upgrade him. After returning to the iron crystal seat, the minute lignification of the internal organs could be dealt with other alchemy potions. Let's keep him alive first. After dealing with it, he turned around and noticed that there was a corpse behind the door. It was still wearing the uniform of the exploration team, but the fatal wound was at the back of the head. It was a gunshot wound. "What's going on?" Huaisher frowned. "Just a spy. Don't worry about it." Ogius sneered and pressed the wound on his chest that almost tore his heart apart. He propped himself up. "How's the iron crystal seat? Didn't you receive our warning not to support?" "Don't worry. The iron crystal seat is safe. Only Raymond and I came here. When I just came in, I heard in the communication that the 2 sides have already started negotiating." Huaisher propped him up from the ground and put him on a stretcher. "Sleep well. When you wake up, you'll be back in the ward of the iron crystal seat. Everyone has worked hard. It's our duty." Ogiest still wanted to say something, but the tranquilizer took effect. He closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, Huaisher pushed open the final door and walked towards the fuse of this war, as well as the greatest prize of war, the sub-control center of the Twilight Village. At the same time, on the scorched earth full of ruins, on the devastated battlefield, the fierce exchange of fire between the 2 sides had come to an end. The huge airship in the sky had already lowered its altitude and confronted the iron crystal seat from a distance. On the ship's hull, the Eye of Nightmare symbol from the Cemetery of the Returnless shone with a cold red light. This famous or notorious mercenary group had been hired by the Ivy League and was the main force of this attack. The iron crystal seat was not damaged at all. Under the Grand Master's secret instrument, no matter how terrifying the firepower was, it was difficult to invade the range of the alchemy array that he had personally created. Both sides could not do anything to each other. On the airship's bridge, Michelle coldly answered the communication. This is Michelle from the Ivy League. He asked, "Who's talking on the other side? Let Mikhail talk to me." "Is this Michelle?" A tired and dispirited voice came from the communicator, causing him to frown unhappily. "I knew it. Only you would do such a troublesome thing at this time." The Grand Master sighed and whispered like a whisper, "Forget it. What's the point of doing this? War is the most meaningless thing to do. No matter what you get, it's all for nothing. When you close your eyes and die, everything you get will return to nothingness. What do you want me to say to you?" Michelle's expression twitched. "When we are buried in the soil, our souls will fall to hell. In the end, what remains is just a gravestone. When that time comes, what's the point of victory and defeat? Nothing." In the silence, the numb voice was still sighing. "When a life is destined to die, all values will eventually return to nothingness. Now, the short struggle at death's door is already too long, let alone the eternal time after death. Michelle, you can understand me if you think about it a little, right? Among all of us, you were once the closest to becoming a Grand Master. You can definitely understand my thoughts. Enough!" Michelle was furious and roared into the communication device. "Can't you let him out after he takes the medicine? Mikhail, how much do you want to humiliate me? You're a Grand Master after all. Don't make such a fool of yourself." He could vaguely hear the chaos on the other end. "Humiliate? I'm just sincerely discussing with you." The Grand Master sighed dejectedly. "Why don't you understand? Humiliation, praise, these are all just superficial. Can you know what other people are thinking in their hearts? Sometimes we don't even know what we're thinking. There are even people who walk around in front of me every day as if they want to seize power. It's too tiring, Michelle. Just breathing is already woo-woo-woo." He seemed to have been covered by someone. Then there was the sound of water being poured, and the communication was suddenly cut off. But not long after, there was the sound of steel rubbing against each other in the midst of the static and electric current. "Long time no see, Michelle." There was a low and cold voice, full of disdain and contempt. "Are you here to wag your tail and beg for mercy?" Chapter 545. Long time no see, Michelle. Are you here to wag your tail and beg for pity? That cold voice asked, full of emotions. "I still remember your unsightly appearance in the society 4 years ago, as if you could become a great grandmaster by crying endlessly." On the bridge, there was a sudden dead silence. No one said a word. When they walked past Michelle, they subconsciously lowered their voices and tiptoed to avoid the area around her. This was because the terrifying coldness of the polar regions was spreading from this man. Even if he was expressionless, one could still feel the anger and ferocity that was suppressed in his heart. The helmet that he was holding in his hand had already cracked. He suddenly wanted to ask the man opposite him, "How did you manage to survive to such an extent of schizophrenia?" Compared to the salted fish that was so negative just now, although he could finally understand human language after taking the medicine, he became even more annoying. It made people want to stuff him into a cannon and shoot him to the bottom of the trench in one breath, or even to a place beyond Pluto in one breath. Perhaps it could be considered as a contribution to the present realm. He gritted his teeth and squeezed out a voice from between his teeth. "Mikhail, you are still as disgusting as before. But I used to like you very much. I remember that you were the one who brought me into the academy, right?" In the sound of the electric current, the Grandmaster sneered indifferently. "You were the one who showed kindness without permission, and you were also the one who carried out resentment without permission. From the beginning to the end, you didn't understand that the outcome of the matter had nothing to do with what you did. You have always overestimated yourself." Dead silence. It was as if a string had been snapped. Under the vicious evaluation from the Grand Master, Michelle's restraint and calmness were finally completely torn apart. For a moment, the man's face turned ashen. Immediately, it was calm again. He just responded indifferently, but Galena chose me in the end. Silence came suddenly. It was long, long, and long. It was so long that people suspected that the other party had disconnected. But Michelle's expression gradually became cheerful. He smiled, happy and mocking, overjoyed. "Do you need me to repeat it?" he said softly. "When you were still engrossed in writing papers on her wedding anniversary, which she had carefully prepared for months, Galena chose me." In the long silence, he seemed to be bathed in a gentle melody. He spread his arms, twisted his body, and smiled at the man on the other end of the call. "Mikhail, I won in the end. It was me." The silence continued, but at that moment, it was as if winter had truly descended. A terrifying killing intent that could freeze one's marrow suddenly descended here. Along with a formless electric signal, the killing intent extracted from countless calamities and miracles actually descended upon this place, condensing into a curse as if it had materialized, angrily ravaging every soul. But Michelle looked as if she was bathing in the spring breeze. She tilted her head and lit the cigarette at the corner of her mouth. He took a deep breath. He let out a long sigh. Basking in his victory, he finally raised his eyes. "I think we can start talking now." "There's nothing to talk about." The Grand Master finally spoke. The harsh sound of steel rubbing against each other became more and more inhuman. "Take your war dogs and your Ivy League and get out of my hell. Michelle, if there is any camaraderie between us, then this is the only thing. Hell is hell, but it's not yours." Michelle retorted coldly. "Moreover, we were the first to complete the landmark exploration. Relying on a leak? Forget it." The Grand Master sneered. "You came to tell me this?" "I just came to make sure if you still have reason." Michelle emphasized, "The battle must be kept within the boundaries. Scared? If you're scared, then go back to your cradle." The Grand Master asked disdainfully, "Would the person who broke through the boundaries first be afraid of the escalation of the war? The American genealogy doesn't mind, but what about the Ivory Tower? The Ivory Tower doesn't care. If you have the guts, you can start an all-out war. Take out the New World Declaration. It doesn't matter. I can make the decision on behalf of the Ivory Tower. Right now, as long as you nod and say that this is what we mean, then the war between us can start. We can even fight to the death. Do you think the Astronomy Society will be so indulgent towards you?" Michelle crushed the cigarette in his hand with a gloomy expression. "Wake up, Mikhail. This is no longer the era of the Republic. When uncle and auntie are in charge, you have to learn to lower your head obediently. I don't need a crying piece of trash to teach me reason. Wait until you become a Grand Master before you say this to me, Mr. Candidate." The Grand Master is really amazing. How good would it have been if you had such courage when you signed the divorce agreement? When the Stoneware Society announced the candidate for the Grand Master, why didn't you have the courage to accept it? Don't you know in your heart whether your lousy results are qualified to be evaluated? Do you think I'm the one who made things difficult? I abstained from voting. The rest of the people voted against it. Losers, go back and cultivate for another 40 years. On the bridge of the Iron Crystal, the people in charge shrank to the back and tried their best not to get involved in this annual large-scale battle of alchemy. The purser and the chief engineer looked at each other and sighed helplessly. It seemed that it was impossible to expect them to come to a conclusion. In the dispute not far away, the communications director waved at the purser and asked him to come over. Then, he stuffed a microphone into the purser's hand. "It's from the other side," said the communications director. The old purser understood. He picked up the microphone and spoke in a flawless, authentic Roman accent. "This is the purser of the Iron Crystal, Simmons Jiang." He was answered by an equally polite voice. "This is the person in charge of the Ivy League troop, Pan DeLong." The old man on the other end said, "It seems that the people in charge of both sides are temporarily unable to fulfill their responsibilities." The purser raised his eyes and looked at the Grand Master, who was arguing in the air. He raised his eyebrows helplessly. "I'm afraid so. I think we need to talk." "I think so too." Then, after a short pause, Pan DeLong suggested, "In order to avoid greater losses, I suggest that we keep the battle within the boundaries. What do you think?" The purser nodded, but was not in a hurry to agree. He only asked, "Very good idea, but what's the boundary?" "The means to stop the war from escalating. Let's have a decisive battle with all the forces in hell. What do you think? No matter what, both sides should not deliberately destroy the Village of Dusk, give preferential treatment to prisoners of war, and not abuse forbidden relics. These are all common rules. I don't think it's necessary to go into details." The purser was unmoved. He asked again, "What about the entry restrictions for both sides?" Pan DeLong was silent for a moment and spoke again. "The Grand Master and the Creator are not allowed to directly intervene. They are not allowed to use the relics of authority or the mark of miracles. As for the sublimators, they are limited to level 5 and below." There was still a lot of room for discussion. The purser smiled. "Let's be straightforward. How about level 4 and below? Isn't this more convenient? We don't have to worry about causing too much damage, right? Isn't this a little too advantageous for your side?" Pan DeLong laughed. "I've personally experienced the means of the judges. Let's just forget about it. Look at what you're saying." Since the first stab didn't work, the purser stabbed again and asked, "Isn't your biological weapon very convenient?" Pan DeLong retorted without hesitation, "If technology is restricted, I'm afraid the number 4 nanosequence of the ivory tower doesn't conform to the rules, right? I'm the one who has the advantage now. Isn't it natural that the terms are more powerful for us?" The purser calmly asked, "Who would play an absolutely fair game? If the advantage is worth a sub-control center, I'm afraid your side won't be able to maintain the advantage for long." Pan DeLong's words seemed to be implying something. The purser calmly responded, "Since you have so much confidence, I'm afraid it's difficult for us to reach a consensus." "But there's still plenty of time, isn't there?" Pan DeLong's tone became complicated. "Before the leaders above finish arguing, we have to come up with a framework." The purser raised his eyes and glanced at the Grand Master, who had begun to take off his underwear when he was a student. He couldn't help but sigh. "Yes, I think we still have a long time to talk slowly." The long night passed just like that. In various senses, there was a lot to talk about. Fortunately, before the arrival of the next day, the purser and Pan DeLong finally talked about a general idea. Although it could only be a general idea, there was no point in talking about it in detail. If both sides really restrained themselves from this fight, it was enough to talk about it to this extent. If they really had no face to continue to entangle with each other, it was useless to talk more. And the annual cat fight in the Alchemist Circle also came to an end. Michel lost. His voice was hoarse first. He couldn't speak. When the man in armor boarded the bridge and nodded to him, he hung up the communication and ignored the Grand Master on the other end. "Did it work?" Michel asked. "According to the map you gave us, we found a total of 16 places tonight. We found another sub-control center in the second place, but we couldn't find any traces in the rest of the places." The man in armor handed over the report. "In a few hours, after the preliminary preparations are completed, we can start the excavation. Very good. Michel pinched his throat, his expression gloomy. Although it was a mistake to directly attack the root of the problem, at least the diversion was successful. When the colonel made a mistake, Pandalong immediately made up for it and changed the priority. Taking advantage of this short night, the Ivy League mobilized all of their manpower to carry out a large-scale search in Hell while enduring the curse. After paying a huge price, they finally found another branch control center among the 16 suspected locations. At least the two sides were once again on the same starting line. Otherwise, he didn't want to see Mikhail again. Unfortunately, he was still one step behind. Just before dawn, the sound of hundreds of ornithopters flapping their wings sounded in the darkest part of the night. The hurricane roared. At the end of the sky, under the illumination of countless searchlights, the giant cube hanging between hundreds of ropes revealed its appearance. The sub-control center buried underground had been uprooted in just one night, and then under the guidance of the navigator, it moved closer to the iron crystal seat. They did it on purpose. They were showing off their spoils to the losers. Michel narrowed his eyes. However, unexpectedly, the mercenary, who had always been shrouded in armor and seemed to be indifferent to everything, raised his eyes, took a few steps forward, and looked under the giant cube from afar. It was a giant truck that was navigating in front. "What's wrong?" Michel asked in a hoarse voice. "Nothing. I just met an acquaintance." The captain of the Eye of Nightmare answered calmly. His fingers clenched and loosened on the weapon at his waist. After a long time, he retracted his gaze. "It's just some old grudges. It's not worth mentioning." He said, "We should go." Michel nodded and turned to leave. In the sky, the giant ship that had been hovering for the night turned around coldly and disappeared into the distance. The war had come to an end once again. However, it did not mean the beginning of peace. What had arrived was only a short gap before the next war. Chapter 546. Huaishur finally witnessed just how ridiculous the production capacity of the Iron Crystal Constellation was. After receiving their reply, hundreds of ornithopters and more engineering equipment were dispatched to complete the excavation of the subcontrol center within half an hour. Scholars and alchemists were remotely assisting the operation of the transfer project. When they returned to the Iron Crystal Constellation, there was already a super-large laboratory under the Iron Crystal Constellation with all kinds of equipment. As the Earth trembled slightly, the control center of Hell landed on the ground. The ceiling quickly closed under the light of the rising sun. With the protection in place, the researchers who had been waiting for a long time rushed out and pounced on the huge cube. Huaishur had nothing to do after that. When he walked up the gangway, he saw the purser waiting there. The old man with a monocle stood in an inconspicuous corner. His black hair was neatly combed behind his head. He did not look old at all. Instead, he was full of energy. "Mr. Huaishur, how's the situation?" Everything went well, although it was a little dangerous. Huaishur smiled and looked back. "But at least we brought our people and the subcontrol center back intact. Thank you for your hard work." The purser nodded and said to the stretcher behind, "Huaishur, you too. Go and rest." "Okay." Ogiest nodded. And when the purser brushed past Ogiest, he seemed to want to say something. But after a long hesitation, he waved his hand. "Forget it. You're on your own." Ogiest had fallen asleep and did not hear him. "How's the Iron Crystal Constellation?" Huaishur asked. "Thanks to the Great Master's maintenance. It's still intact." When he said this, the purser's expression was very strange. It was as if something particularly difficult to explain had happened, but he could not tell others for some reason. The purser's desire to talk mixed with his desire to restrain himself. He wanted to say something, but stopped. In the end, he could not say anything. You've been working hard all night. I've asked someone to clean up the room. The purser said, do you need to rest? No. I'm going to see how the students are doing. Huaisher thought for a moment and asked, is there something wrong? More or less. The purser waved his hand and motioned for Huaisher to follow him. After a night of fighting, we talked for another night and finally came to a conclusion. Although the first branch control center is in our hands, Ivy League seems to be unusually determined this time. They don't intend to back down at all and are prepared to fight with us here. Do we need to ask the Ivory Tower for help? The other party is probably afraid that the scale of the war will escalate, so they took the initiative to talk to us. The purser said, if possible, everyone would like to use the least amount of effort to decide the ownership of this hell. Although it will definitely belong to us, it would be better if we could obtain it with less effort and less effort. So, for the time being, we have reached a consensus. They had reached the park at the bottom of the Iron Crystal Constellation. Officially, this was the Ecological Physiotherapy Center, but in fact, it was just a park. In order to prevent the crew members from having any mental problems during the hellish voyage, the Pharaoh Crystal Constellation had also built a pleasant ecological park for the crew to relax occasionally and prevent them from getting sick from holding it in. It was about the size of a large football field, and under the influence of the meticulous design and various technologies, it did not look narrow at all. It made people feel refreshed. At this time, almost everyone was walking around the branch control center. There was no one in the park, and it was quiet except for a few pigeons that were kept in the wild. The purser found a stool and sat down. He said seriously, although it is a bit abrupt to say it now, the ownership of this hell may depend on you. What? Huaisher was stunned. He looked over and said, me? What do I have to do? On the Pharaoh Crystal Constellation, there was only one Ascendant Grandmaster, not to mention the other high-level scholars and alchemists. In terms of experts, the person in charge of the exploration team gave Huaisher an unfathomable feeling. Occasionally, when they exchanged pointers, he would even give Huaisher a sense of deadly crisis. According to Huaisher's estimation, if he fought with all his strength, he might be killed on the spot in 2 or 3 moves. On the ship, there were probably a few ascendants who were not inferior to him. Now, they were all relying on him. This was too much of a joke. He was here to lead a team on a trip. It was fine that he became the person in charge for no reason. At most, he would just take the blame. Why did he suddenly become the scapegoat and send himself to death? Generally speaking, after a discussion between the two sides, in order to not destroy hell to the greatest extent, they decided to limit the ascendant's level to below level 4, and they are not allowed to use miraculous inscriptions or taboo relics. Therefore, among all the people who can be used, the one who can fight the most is you. Just like that, he inexplicably became the number 1 tool. I shouldn't have been in the limelight in the first place. Huaisher's expression twitched. He regretted it. It was so good to be a mascot, obediently. Why couldn't he control himself? Don't worry. No matter what, the Ivory Tower won't leave all the work to you alone. The purser's words made Huaisher heave a sigh of relief, but then her heart sank to the bottom of the valley. We will support you silently from behind and support you. Awesome. Seeing Huaisher rolling his eyes, the purser smiled awkwardly. I'm just kidding. Don't be nervous. I thought that's what you idols say. Where did all of you come from? Huaisher covered his face and sighed. Please don't worry. Whether it is manpower or material resources, the Iron Crystal Constellation will give you the greatest support. Moreover, you don't need to be in charge. You're only responsible for commanding and executing. You don't need to be at the forefront. The specific plan may need to be formulated after the research on the branch control center is completed. But before that, there are still many things that can help you complete. The purser pondered for a moment and suddenly asked, "Do you mind if I take a look at the group you recruited?" "The group of rats?" Huaisher asked. "No, the ones in the cage." The purser smiled. "Before I was in charge of miscellaneous things on the ship, I was also a researcher on border creatures and hordes of hell. I might be able to help young Arbiter of Destiny." There was nothing wrong with that. Huaisher raised his hand and chanted. A rather handsome crow jumped out of the bone burial sanctuary and landed on Huaisher's arm. It spread its wings and cawed excitedly. The purser adjusted his monocle, raised his arm, and whistled twice at the crow. The crow looked at Huaisher. After seeing that Huaisher had no intention of refusing, it obediently jumped onto the purser's arm and allowed him to inspect its wings and bones. How rare! The purser narrowed his eyes and carefully looked at its appearance. The death energy is very pure, and it is very close to nature. It should have reproduced in a very stable environment in hell for more than 10 generations, right? In addition to the influence of your stigmata, there are also traces of a relatively high level of origin substance in its body. This attribute, is it a dream? How strange. He looked for a long time and raised his head. Was their clan blessed by the one who wore the dream crown? If it weren't for young Arbiter of Destiny's restrictions, it wouldn't be strange for them to suddenly evolve into nightmares. Ahaha, probably. Huaisher laughed awkwardly and changed the topic. He couldn't say that they lived in a cage made of decaying dreams every day, could he? It was hard to say whether people would believe him or not. For young Arbiter of Destiny, they are indeed a very good clan. Congratulations, Mr. Huaisher. The purser politely returned the crow after inspecting it for a while. Did you discover anything? Huaisher asked. They were born with special characteristics, developed quite well, and their origin substance has undergone a very high level of change. If you want to talk about problems, there are almost no problems. The purser thought for a moment, then said seriously, but in reality, this is a problem in itself. HM? Huaisher didn't understand. It's like this. If they could be raised to this level in a slightly weaker state, they would have probably reached the limit of a large group long ago. However, due to their superior constitution, this barrier is actually quite difficult to overcome. Can you understand? The purser thought for a moment, then explained. You see, it's just like how young people nowadays draw cards to raise little sprites. If the sprites are born with a weaker constitution, they will have an easier time evolving than other sprites. Although they were both in large groups, the difference between the rat men and the gargoyles was immeasurable. An entire company of rat men might not even be able to defeat a single gargoyle. Even a fully equipped Black Death army would only be able to defeat a single gargoyle in a head-on battle. If they didn't make any preparations beforehand, the gargoyle would simply flap its wings and fly away, and they would only be able to watch. Even if they are in large groups, their strength is not certain. In fact, all kinds of ridiculous situations are not rare either. Every species has their own unique large groups. Some are incredibly powerful, while others don't even exist. And your army, after young Arbiter of Destiny's interference, can be considered to have separated from its original group and become a completely new group of abyss creatures. However, because their constitution is too outstanding, it is even more difficult for them to evolve compared to other abyss creatures. Their potential is too outstanding, so it is even more difficult to reach the limit. At this point, the purser's expression became serious. This is the most dangerous part. Before they become a large group, if you use too cruel methods to raise them, it may cause them to mutate and degenerate into corrosive species. At that time, Young arbiter of destiny's stigmata may also shatter under the backlash of the mandate of destiny. You have to be especially careful. Okay. Please continue. It was rare to meet an expert to consult, so Weischer had already taken out a small notebook and started to jot down the key points. He had done a lot of preparation and read a lot of books, but there were still many doubts that had not been solved. Instead, the more he read, the more questions he had. Now that the purser was kind enough to help, he naturally had to seize the opportunity to ask clearly. Then Weischer finished jotting down a paragraph, then looked up and asked, "What's the difference between the corrosive species and the abyss creatures?" Well, if you want to talk about the decisive difference, it should be stability. The purser explained, among the hundreds of thousands of different corrosive species that we have discovered so far, none of them are the same or similar. They are mutated creatures that were affected by the abyssal sediment. More or less, there are various defects in their bodies that cannot be replicated or even survive for too long. They exist as a special case, but a large group is different. Every large group has a stable structure and inheritance, and is adaptable to the abyss. They can expand their group through reproduction, and can already be seen as a part of the abyss's ecosystem. So, before they become a large group, you have to be careful not to let them stay in abnormal areas and states for too long, including the situation last night. You should not let them fight. Although their resistance is strong, as a species, they are still too young. Once they cannot adapt, they will suffer great damage. As the purser spoke, Weischer kept jotting down notes, including how to raise the crows, things to take note of, risks to be avoided, and even possible ways to strengthen them. Although Weischer could not use most of it, including how to avoid diseases and curses, it was more convenient for Weischer to understand the abyss creatures systematically. After almost filling up a small notebook, Weischer finally stopped. Finally, he asked solemnly, "In your opinion, how far are they from a large group?" The purser fell silent. There is a lot of research in this area, but there are not many cases to refer to because birds, especially crow with negative origin substances, are already very rare. There is not much research on them. Your army has also undergone a special origin substance qualitative change, so there is no precedent. After thinking for a while, the purser said slowly, "However, the large groups we know now have at least some common characteristics. For example, they have been recognized and blessed by a ruler, have merged with a disaster or miracle, or have completely occupied the position of overlord of a certain hell. I feel that if you have no clue, you can start from these three aspects." At this point, he patted Sui Xiong's shoulder meaningfully. "See, now is a good opportunity." After saying this, he did not wait for Weischer to react, and left with his hands behind his back. Weischer was left alone in the same place. After a long time, he finally reacted. Wait a minute, wasn't he just going to use him as a tool? Of the three characteristics mentioned by the purser, the first was to obtain the recognition and blessings of a certain ruler. The Cage of Dreams was directly taken care of, with the remains of the previous ruler of the dream realm protecting them. Their origin substance had already changed. This was much better than simply obtaining the recognition and blessings of a few drops of water. The second was that they had merged with a disaster or miracle. Basically, they had been born with a sacred insignia. This was something that Xiaoxi Ming's power could also take care of. At this point, all of the crow were part of Weischer's subordinate army. Apart from the 9 candle crows, the rest were all backup souls. As long as Weischer used Xiaoxi Ming's origin substance to slowly raise them, he would be able to change their attributes bit by bit. In the end, all that was left was to occupy a certain hell. Wasn't this just a coincidence? There was a 9th hell right in front of him, waiting for him to explore. It could only be said that the older the ginger, the spicier it was. They were afraid that Sui Xiong would not be able to do the work, so they still hung a carrot in front of him. However, since the method was right in front of Huai Shi had to at least give it a try. As long as he didn't die trying, he rubbed his chin and began to think about his plans to conquer the abyss. It seemed perhaps there really was a way. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.